Michelle, how you doing? And Andrew Luber. How are we all doing? Everyone doing all right?
Doing pretty good. Nice haircut, Daniel.
I needed it desperately. Oh my gosh. Oh my freaking goodness. It's crazy. But it's good to see you. I hope you have been doing well. So I've been reading, I should tell you, there's a guy online. So there's a few things. Michelle and I were talking about risk. Jacob Kashir is here from Sense Space. And Philip Shen. It is Philip Shen. Oh my goodness. It is Philip Shen. How did Shakespeare go? How did Shakespeare go, Mr. Shen? How did it go?
Oh, so good, so good. I just got done Sunday. So it's a show all about it was Julius Caesar. So it's all about the assassination of that guy. But I was really taken by, as I always am with Shakespeare, just how much emphasis he puts on the magic of language, how like language is actually the world that we inhabit. And
Wow.
there's just a lot of cool intrigue in that play. So yeah, I had a great time.
Wow. Well, that's
Couldn't be
amazing.
back
Your
here.
timing for a political play could not have been better, actually. So well done, Julius Caesar. That's perfect. And Mr. Samuel Barnes, is good to see you. Well, it's actually, it's wonderful because it's perfect because I've been thinking a lot. I just got Owen's book, Raymond K. Hessel. He goes, Owen, and it's Defensology. And I've been starting it, and it's really interesting. And some of the things he was talking about, how is in the classical mind, you actually could not be rational if you couldn't go on the military battlefield, if you actually were not able to physically engage in the world. Like today, we think of the rational as something possible without the engagement, like actually going. And it's very interesting because the book is also quite centered. And we can talk about anything, but I've been really taken by Owen's work. He does such tremendous work. And he has wonderful podcasts with Samuel Barnes right there, Schizo FM, baby. And one of the things that is interesting that is being talked about is how today we tend to think about aggression as either a evolutionary product, like something that's biological, you're aggressive to have natural selection, or aggression as a result of some psychological repression. So aggression is something you can get rid of. It's just finding the right, sociological condition, or the right enlightenment, or the right honey bun, the right dessert. Michelle's making marinara sauce right now, and if it's really tasty, all my aggression will go away. So, that's a medicine. Mr. Jockin, good to see you as well. And I hope the class on beauty is going well, Mr. Jockin. The recorded lectures have been tremendous. The live ones are starting, I believe, next week. Is it, Mr. Jock, pretty soon? Excellent. So that's very, very good. But one of the ideas here is like, well, what if actually aggression is not something we can get rid of, but it's a kind of feature of the soul, if you will, like the idea of the spirit, where we tend to go, okay, logos is part of the soul. Sure, that's great. Intellect is great. Eros, that pleasure, that's good. But what if aggression is actually somehow part of the human being? And instead, the name of the game is a harmony, as we've talked about before, between like logos, eros, and thymos. And if you ignore the aggression, say a Francis Fukuyama kind of idea that we can deal with it simply by, giving everyone enough pleasure, corporate, you can climb the ladder you're good with. Well, if aggression is instead something that has to be considered as part of the soul, if you don't, you're going to get various pathologies. That's a very different matter. Like you have to have that thymotic address. You have to have a society that is viewing aggression as always already part of the human condition. And actually the point that he's getting at as well is if indeed you can't actually be rational or intelligent without aggression, then removing, that's the issue. Like you remove that, then the other two like eros and logos are actually impossible. Because there is something about the mind that puts itself in the battlefield. Maybe we can even say put itself in the story where you can encounter limit and thus theme. Like if you do not do that, you can't do the other two. So then it's a perennial problem that we have to deal with, that if we don't deal with it, there's going to be all sorts of unintended consequences. But then, of course, it's like, well, what are we saying? Should we go back to the, because he talks a lot. He's actually, him and Joshua Hansen did a great class on Paul Virilio, and then I'll pass it to Mr. Luber, on the idea that, what does he say? It's something like, today, we've moved from kind of the direct sort of like military general to the security apparatus that operates instantaneously, like nuclear weaponry, and it's like really, really fast. So what that does is create the illusion, well, it creates the kind of feeling that the problem of aggression has been done away with, right? Like, or that it's not an option to have these military things. But that may not be the case because it might, as Dr. Simpkin talks about, just go to drone warfare or something like that. But then at the flip side, if that has made you complacent about the themos, actually, Aspasia told me I was saying that word wrong. That is more themos, and you're supposed to do this with your fists when you say it, and I have it in wherever Aspasia is right now, because he's Greece, he's probably like throwing up. I'm really sorry. Aspasia over there in Sydney, my mistake. So there's this notion of how do you address that versus become complacent about it, which under the nuclear, looming apocalypse, it's easy to do. Which then, the other last point is that if you don't address the thymotic, what you actually end up with very often is a eros, a consumption that is never done. You always have to consume forever. Or you get the intellectual mind that is always trying to control other people, that becomes kind of logos based and things like that. So it's very interesting. And I've also been studying how there's mostly an inverse relationship between profit and wages in the history of the world, where actually increased profits don't necessarily translate into increased wages, which is a very odd phenomenon in the history of economics. And that's Mr. John Trossi. What a treat. But let me give it to Mr. Andrew Luber here. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir.
Okay, that last part threw me off because now I'm just curious. How is that the case? Can you explain that? Because that is very weird.
Isn't that weird? Yeah, I know. So I'll say it quickly and then we can get into it, but it's actually relevant to the defense topic. In order to have wages and profits correlate, there needs to be a competition for human labor. Or like if there's no competition for workers, then there is no reason to move profit to wages, right? So human capital is what they'll talk about. But here's the issue. That means you need the Earl Thompson and Cole Huntington over at UCLA have a lot of papers on this. So in order to have a competition for labor, you have to have very distinct entities, whether it be companies. So you can start with companies, but then if you get kind of a monopolistic structure, this isn't going to work. So then you need competitions between nations, and nations are competing for human resources. But of course, that means there's the threat of war, right? But that creates a competition. And then you also, though, have to have the possibility of immigration so that people can freely move between. So you need distinct entities and easy flow, which are precisely the conditions that can make people tempted by popularism as the immigration flows or fall into war. So this is actually to deal with the problem of and the Black Death's a good example, because the other thing there's a lot of people die, and in the book Silk Roads they talk about this. Well, wages skyrocket because human labor, there's a competition for workers. So existential crises like Studebaker was talking about. But this creates a big problem, because that means the conditions of globalization, which tend to remove distinctions of nations, which arguably increases profits, lowers wages. Well, it doesn't seem like lowering profits is the answer to increase wages. Well, then we have some sort of unsolved socioeconomic paradox that has to be thought through. But I'll pause there. So that's generally, there's much more to be said, but it actually would lead into the geopolitical defense questions and so on, and what does that look like? But let me give it back to you, Mr. Luber, and then I'll give it to Philip Shin.
Yeah, I just have more questions about that. I guess so. Like the Republicans right now, their stance seems to be, isolationist. So it sounds like what that would do is potentially increase competition in the immediate within our own country. But as time goes on, that stance would actually destroy the competition, because a lack of flow, as you put it, would occur. People wouldn't want to be, I guess, doing business, or immigration in terms of business wouldn't be as possible, because business would just be operating within the entity, the United States. Is that fair to say?
That's very fair to say, because you have to find this odd balance where if you remove immigration entirely, well, then there's no competition. But then if there's no definitiveness of the distinct nations that can operate according to their own logic and their own laws and different things, then you also are too much on the side of not having the ability of distinction and connection. this, like, that's kind of a way to think of it. Nations have to be distinct, legal frameworks have to be distinct, but then there simultaneously has to be an ease of movement between them, which is very, very difficult to maintain. But if you cannot, then you have a disconnect between profits and wages. Oh, I should note that the other strategy is to be a really strong nations that make all the other nations poor, so there's no desire to go to other nations, right? Then there's no competition either. So there's also a hegemonic strategy. So there are different strategies that nations go about on this.
It seems that this issue is parallel to the issue of motivation and drive, just because it's like you need to have motivation that has to do with extrinsic motivation, but it can't solely rely on extrinsic motivation, and same with like the intrinsic motivation. Like there needs to be some type of motivation that is aware of how it moves between intrinsic and extrinsic. Which I started reading Schelling. Schelling wrote I just finished reading up Heidegger on Schelling, and it made me want to read Schelling, so I started reading Schelling. And Schelling he wrote a book about basically like the philosophy of mythology, and it's his like last lectures in the 1840s. And it's interesting because it seems like he is talking about religion and situating religion within this problem, where there needs to be a religion that isn't just I guess like verified through like some external phenomena, and it can't just be like intrinsically verified, because then the universal believability of it essentially becomes not a thing if you as an individual just posit it in a certain sense. So he's talking about like this concept of like philosophical religion, which is interesting because I know Heidegger is very against this notion, or at least a part of his, time. I think it's like middle Heidegger. I don't know which one, but like, basically, it just the point being is like there's this philosophical religion that is able to understand the religious position such that it's in this in between space. Um, it just seems like all of these problems, all these different domains, are just circling this position that hasn't been scaffolded out yet. And this position is like bouncing in between extrinsic and intrinsic, essentially. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. And then with what you were saying earlier, before that, I'm curious what his argument is on aggression. I got a sense of it, but if you could elaborate on that, that would be great. I just my take on these different people having these notions of overcoming different emotive stances, basically being the deadliest thing to human race. It's like any type of overcoming some type of mood is literally cutting you off from being a human being. So to me, it's like what makes a good story isn't not having moods. It's like being super moody and just being able to express that mood in an appropriate manner. So like I think like my take on aggression personally is be super angry. Like be really angry, but have the balance of being able to think through your anger. Like you can act on your anger once you thought through it. And like to me what that means is just like you're angry and you deconstruct the idea in which your anger is situated in. And then after that deconstruction, you act. And then in that sense, you're still angry. It's not like when you think through your anger, like you don't have that, or just any negative emotion. It's not like you get rid of the negative emotion. It's just you're able to like express that to the external in a way that people can digest and take in your negative emotion. Because to me, the question isn't how to overcome your anger, it's how to express your anger that allows other people to register it and address back. Because a big problem is like, oh, if you get angry, if you yell, if you do X or Y, you're gonna like destroy the possibility of, a conversation or a situation. No one would want to deal with you. So to me, it's not overcoming the emotion or getting rid of it. It's just properly expressing it. And that's just being able to think through your emotion and not think through your emotion, but without the idea of, oh, I'm going to overcome this emotion. Like I'm being patient. I'm not going to act. So that way I can let the emotion like subside and go away. That's like bullshit to me. To me, what's real is you think through your emotion so you know how to properly express it, not to get rid of it. It's like a delusion in my mind. The other way around. So yeah, I just want to say that. I'll pass it.
Beautiful. No, I think those are wonderful comments. And Tyler, is good to see you. Mr. Alex Ebert is good to see you as well. I hope everyone as well knows a few things. I think that space you're tracing out on this tension between the intrinsic and the extrinsic, the globalization and reversing globalization, centralization and decentralization. Like if you take the reason why I like the paradox, if you will, between tracing the history of profit and wages is really in that trade-off, which you would never suspect. You really see the primacy of economic history, of things happening outside the market that impact the market. Therefore, the market is never isolated. It's always in a nexus of the capital nation state, as Karatani would put it. And what you see is some sort of capacity to maintain openness without losing definition, which all like neoliberalism had. The mistake of neoliberalism is basically having openness, not realizing that with it would take definitiveness, like the ethos. So then I know Mr. Barnes was speaking Cadell about that, and that's very, very important. One of the two, like Owen actually had a really good, and then I'll give it to Philip Shin here, a really good introductory video to his book on his channel that I would highly suggest. And one of the things that he was talking about is how in the ancient mind, and this would actually tie to Ivan Illich, you're not free if you don't have capacity. Like if you don't have capacity, if you can't do anything, then sure, you're free, but you're not actually. Like Ivan Illich, there you go, Mr. Barnes. Like Ivan Illich talks about disablement, where the notion is today we're disabled. Like if you, now it's trade-offs, it's not all bad. Like if you have a grocery store available to you, then you don't tend to learn to hunt because you don't need to, but that means in a way you've lost the skill. There's a disablement that has occurred because you have access to that, to the grocery store, right? And every technology, everything that human beings create that trade-off. That doesn't mean it's good. That doesn't mean it's bad, but that means if there's something about freedom in the way that the modern world thinks about it, that tends to remove capability. And classically, you're not free unless you have capability, then there's some new intentional training, intentional cultivation, infrastructurally, socially, whatever, that has to be brought into the picture. That I think what Owen would say is that classically, that was taken care of by military, like military involvement, or just the necessity of national defense, or just the necessity of an army, of which was much more pronounced before the notion of instantaneous destruction of nuclear warheads. Now, you could argue that the instantaneous destruction of nuclear warheads was necessary for the quote-unquote Great Peace. I think Harari argues that in his book, Homo Deus or whatever. And there are, like, Pinker says that, and so on and so forth. Whether you take that line or not, there's still the issue of disablement that has to be addressed with some alternative infrastructure to deal with. And basically, here's the point. If you do not cultivate capacity and give people freedom, they eventually get really, really discouraged. They get really angry. They feel really crushed, and there can be an uprising that could internally tear apart your nation, right? But then if you have obviously the military training, or that means there's distinct nations, and you could have an external war, right? Which could be terrible for everyone, right? And this problem, this is my point, this problem, and then I'll give it to Philip Chen, this problem of dealing with capacity and freedom, enablement and freedom, which is the thymotic problem, actually seems to also be paralleled by the paradox of the relationship between wages and profit and economics. The very conditions that lead to the loss of the training of the thymotic are also the ones where profits really take off without wages. Now, Marx understood that. Like, we could all say, well, isn't that what Marx is all about? The idea that the owners of the means of production don't share the profit. I think, yeah, that's what he's talking about. But the key is that Earl Thompson wants to locate the problem not so much in the issue of captured surplus value, but in the lack of competition between human beings for human capital, right? Now, again, a good example of this is somewhere like Amazon. You say, well, wait a minute, isn't Amazon super profitable? And don't they have higher wages than other companies? And your brain goes, well, that's because they have higher wages because they have higher profits. That's what your brain says. What Earl Thompson tells you is, no, no, no. Amazon has to keep the talent from other tech companies. It's the competition with the other tech companies that's primary in the high wages, not actually the profit. The competition for labor is first, then the profit is second. And that's really important because that would have larger issues nationally, governmentally, economically, and so on and so on. But let me give it to Mr. Philip Shen. Mr. Shen, it is so good to have you back. I'm so glad you did the Shakespeare, but it's glad that you're here, sir.
Ditto, and this is a perfect segment into revealing our little idea for the liminal web games. Like a lot of the profit that's happening isn't even from the products that these companies are making, but the manipulation of financial instruments, much more in like the fictitious capital realm. And I think like to get to the themos, some kind of extra market competition would be very interesting to move people from these sort of like specialist dwarfs with giant ears to more Vitruvian men. And I think I shared this idea with you a few months back, Daniel, but it's sort of like the Olympics. Let's just imagine that there's 5 different contests, in a way to see if you're real or not. One would be like a hand-eye sport. One would be like a balance sport. One would be like a philosophy competition. One could be an art competition, and one could be, I don't know, like wooing a woman. I don't know how these would be judged, but I just think, you get these random things together, right? And then you say, okay, let's get a group of people together and we'll do it on this day. And say like, let's see, say like Jockin is like really good at boxing, right? And so we decide like whatever, I guess one of the sports is going to be boxing. So for that, year before, I would start training myself in that discipline to add a skill, knowing that there's a limited amount of time that I can give to each one. And maybe the winner would be some kind of cumulative score across all the different disciplines. So that might be like an interesting way of being like, okay, there's some kind of war simulation that we could do outside of the market that is a little bit more of us inventing the parameters and being like, most of the things in the market are heading toward, kind of replacing the carbon-based life with silicone-based life, a la Nick Land, and like just how to, with these war simulations, point towards a good life. Specifically with this question, I wonder what you think about this, Dana, with like, what do you do between the ages of post-graduation and pre-retirement?
I think that's magnificent. The idea of something like in 1 year, and then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin, there will be this liminal Olympics or whatever we want to call it. And these are the things, and it would be, you would select the things you do relative to, say, perhaps the community that is hosting it or people that you know. So there are some things that some people are already doing, like Jockin already does boxing. So then the rest of us for a year have to train at boxing so that we lose well versus, you know, lose terribly. And there's something about like that sort of creative thinking is precisely what is required to be intentional about, to create enablement in a world where your macro more naturally disables. But the reasons it disabled are actually good. I like Food Lion. I like all these. I think the trade-off of not having to hunt in order to get pizza at all these is grand. But I also recognize that in that trade-off, there's an issue, right? And you could just extract that to everything, right? So if that's the case, if you're going to keep modern conditions and the conveniences, then you yourself are going to have to be intentional about creating places of training, if you will, places of cultivation. You know, you yourself have to decide you're going to read philosophy. You yourself are going to have to do boxing. You yourself are going to have to do that. And again, the natural disposition to that is to say, oh, it's just arbitrary and silly. We're just making games for ourselves, whatever. Well, if we take seriously that market societies have to be created, that the kind of society you are in is a product of conventions that were created by people, rather it be the notion of the commodity form, the church, the communal square, or different things like that, then this has always been the history of things. This has always been how we've had to do things. And there's a way in which, in precisely the total saturation of the dominance of neoliberalism, if you will, or however you want to language this, there's a return to an awareness of the need to be intentional about this, right? Or to simply reject it and to go back to hunting in the woods. And hey, the belonging again isn't going to make fun of the Amish or Mennonite or more, you know, reject. There's some real legitimacy to that. But the paradox is the modern condition that is able to maintain the enablement while simultaneously not withdrawing entirely, right? But that's really, really tense, and it requires things like that. So I really like that example. And Mr. Jockin, would you like to tell us how badly you would beat us all in boxing when we do the Olympics? You want to give us some tips, some coaching? We could use some coaching now, Mr. Jockin, please.
Generally, I find beginners have a bad habit of being too upright. They, you know, because it's true. Because the problem is, it's boxing. You learn you have to tuck your chin down is a very uncommonly important skill to learn. Mainly because your main danger area in your physiology is your chin. Because basically a twist this way or back causes most of the concussive damage to the head injury. Your top of your head actually is quite stable. It can handle a lot of damage directly without much consequence from a concussion point of view. Also body shots, but that's a separate. Actually, the secret weapon to get good at boxing very rapidly, to knock someone out quickly, a body shot to the liver. Does not matter if you're conscious or not. You will have automatic shutdown if your name of the game is to knock someone down and keep them down for 10 seconds. You win that way. And doesn't matter how strong you are, or a clear shot there works best. Anyways.
God bless you, Thomas Jockin. He's given us all the secrets of the trade just freely. What a generous soul. It just pours out.
Also, another bonus with the liver shot is that also you have a less likelihood to break your hand if you're just using it with because basically your head, especially if you hit the top of the head, you could break someone's hand very easily. That's also good. That's also why tucking your chin in matters a lot. Because if you just duck into the shot and take it at the top of the head, you'll break someone's hand, especially if it's unpadded or unguarded. Liver shots, your ribs are not that strong. So it's the danger to you as the attacker is much lower. Anyway, so actually on these notes, here's the thing is that it's all about information mechanisms. That's what was going on here. So notice here that box GPT. So notice here, even in that example of boxing, I'm actually pointing out there are the rules of the game actually give you multiple avenues of access. So to win does not have one metric alone. It's hit and not get hit, right? That's the basic principle, and that can be achieved by many different means. So one is brute strength, right? And obviously that's one thing too. There's a reason why boxing classes have weight classes, because after a certain, basically, if you don't have that, that overpowers all the other criterion and evaluations of the contest. Because if just physical body strength is the dominant one, then that's it. It will obfuscate all the other ones. But I just say that because the thing about human existence in life is that culture, and it was brought up before by Philip. A lot of economic wealth came from financial instruments. had an interest rates, basically 0% interest rates environments, had nothing to do with any of the actual business activity of these organizations and entities. It was simply they were financial instruments that were just operating through. So actually the kind of action signal apparatus was distorted because of those things. And that's kind of the problem, is that a lot of these interactions have multiple layers of effects. And I also say that because even in boxing, a lot of the question of what boxing matches happen are actually evaluated not just simply on athletic ability. It's also based on what's your follower count, how many people can you bring to the audience, how many people pay-per-view. These are all business metrics that have some loose correlation to ability, but not necessarily. There's some fantastic boxers that no one knows about. And there's some boxers, the YouTube boxer phenomenon is basically an example of that, where the criterion of success is basically, and I've been guilty of it, I literally just want to watch to see how bad this goes. It has nothing to do with any competition or excellence. I'm just saying that, so like, that's part of the danger of society, is that we live in abstractions. And it's kind of the bill on your point of modern society does disable us. A very simple part is, I'll tell everyone else, here's the simple part. I don't know about anybody else, but when I have to write a handwritten letter, I spell a lot better than when I do typing out, because I got spell check. And if spell check stops working, I'm in deep trouble on the computer. Also, I'm looking incomprehensible, let alone even in Plato, they talk about this in Phaedrus, writing. Writing is a technology. And it was very suspicious, because what it did was it destroyed your ability to memorize. And memory was one of the major metrics of intelligence. How much could you memorize? And in fact, it still is in a lot of traditions. The Islamic tradition of memorization of the Quran. It is a measure, it's a sign of intelligence that you can memorize the Quran and its chapters. So this is a very classic tradition, is that attitude of memory with intelligence. So look at that as my point. No one would even think that anymore, that memory has a correspondence with intelligence. But there's a nuance, like things like recall is one of our which is just rapidity of memorization recall, right? So we have interesting angles. We still use it, but not in the way we normally think of. So I'm just saying that the issue is that there's these abstractions. That's what society does. Society creates all these abstractions, so the activities may not be honest signals. And that's always the problem. So this is like an image appearance problem of reality dynamic. aka take my course, because that's basically what the discussion on the beautiful is from Plato, is the issue of reality to images. And part of the danger is you may get image signals that have no correspondence to what you think is causing them. They're confounded by by the layered of abstractions along the way. Actually, in modern society, it's funny when if you can't use a physical domain, right? We use war, I use the example of it. The one area of contest that you actually see the strongest kind of remaining of it in modern society, sales, because there's an honest signal. At least there's a more honest signal argument that the actions in connection to reality, that when one does certain activities, there is an outcome measured in money. There's a concrete measure, and there's a correspondence of action to result, relative theoretically. Even that, it still gets a little messy. But I'm saying that I'm just drawing out the distinction. Part of the problem of modern society is we've abstracted action from consequence, X signal to result. As a result, we have this kind of basically what we brought before, Daniel, this mental illness problem, in the sense of rationality is no longer being bounded to reality with a correspondence. So how do we answer this? And actually, as part of the issue, it's funny, in sales, they tell you, no, dig into your emotions, use your emotions, kind of channel with it. That's why I'm bringing this up, because in literature and sales, they'll talk about it this way. Because this idea, that's the closest approximation we have to the contest, but the contest is dependent on direct correspondent signal relationships to action to result, to some measure of significance. So that's part of the problem of modern society, is that we've abstracted away the consequence so far away in a lot of dynamics. So as a result, the emotions, the competition, the thumos is basically a liability. Just basically be a feeder. If I be really brass about it, be a feeder, consume, and work as the battery for consumption and basically for the mechanisms of indirect consumption to operate society. That would seem to be the kind of effect of all this. And it's almost kind of interesting, because language has played a powerful role on this too, because language is an abstraction. That's the whole point. It's an abstractional interface that we're using to map onto reality a lot of ways. And our use of language, as Daniel kind of building your projects, right? The whole idea is that our use of analogical, metaphorical language awakens during certain directions, or awakens possibilities of activity and models of approach. So just kind of riffing on these points, I think it's a great conversation. And Andrew Luber, your answer is Jake Paul's a very good amateur boxer. To answer that point, I think as an amateur, he's competent. He'd be like a competent amateur boxer. Upper weighter classes, like the 190 range, 180 range. Like I would say, just on that point of Luber, I would say, yeah, he's perfectly competent amateur. He's been boxing for 5 years, I think. So he's around that range. So that's perfectly fine. Is he a pro boxer? Absolutely not. So thus, with this whole Tyson fight that's going to occur, the really only question is just the weighting. This is the condition of Tyson. If his condition didn't deteriorate so bad, he's almost 50. So this is a little ridiculous. It wouldn't be a contest. What's going to happen? The difference of skill. But anyways, that's why I got yield.
Oh, that's hilarious. I'll give it this button. I actually, as you were speaking right there, I wanted to bring in the ESPN 30 for 30 music and have cuts to like pictures in a newspaper of Ponce and then Tyson. And we could have really done that and had that like epic build-up feel. It would have been really good. So thank you, Box GPT. Really appreciate it, Mr. Jockin. We need that. One of the things that Owen was talking about that I found really, really interesting, and I do think it connects to Earl Thompson's. Now, I do have some criticisms of Earl, Mr. Dr. Thompson, because a lot of this is the trade-off between profit and wages, but you could also make an argument that wealth is a distinction, like technological wealth and technological advancement. And although wages seem to fall, wealth could go up. And I think that's where someone like a Dietrich McCloskey would run in. But then I would say to Dietrich, I say, well, that might actually make it worse. Because if people are surrounded by better and better wealth and technologies that they cannot access because they do not have the wages to do it, then that could create social unrest. So there's some interesting tension between profit, wages, and wealth. If wealth, we mean more in this more expanded sense of including technological well-being like air conditioning. But those three have to be thought. The point is this, they don't necessarily share a correlative relationship. And that's what you're kind of led to believe. Is that if like one of those, like if profits go up, the other two go up as well, including wages and wealth. And that may not be true. And if that is not true, that has to be taken very, very seriously. The other thing I was going to say, so Owen was saying that basically we make a massive mistake following Virilio to not realize that the modern, like a lot of what military strategy is about the question of mobility, the controlling of mobility, the controlling of movement, all of these different things. And he says, if you look at a modern city, this is the Virilio point, it's all about the control of the flow of movement and the flow of how people operate in different things, right? Oh, and I'll also note, in a world where you are at war, you were saying like this relationship between the environment and what is rational, being a military strategist genius makes you like the top of the totem pole. But in a world where that's not so interesting, being really good at astrophysics may be the top of the pole. So it's interesting how rationality that we cherish is relative to the environment we are in. And I think we do make a mistake. And Thompson was saying this, we make a mistake to forget that it is not the entity that determines its evolutionary fittedness, but the environment that selects for fittedness. The environment is primary in evolution, not the entity. And if you get that wrong, then you fail to realize the need to be aware of your environment and how that's situating rationality in different ways. So that's a very interesting point that I think has consequences. Because then, of course, if it is true what Plato is saying, that there is something about the inability to be fully rational without the thematic, the thymos, then environments that don't create the thymos simultaneously cannot select people or evolve people, if you will, in a direction that would realize the fullness of spirit, as Plato was saying. So that's a big deal. But the point on mobility is this, and this blew my mind when Owen was talking about it from Virilio. Virilio says and because Owen is critiquing the idea that Peter Thiel says that we had innovation in the world of bits and now, in the world of atoms, but now it's in bits. We haven't had speeding up cars or speeding up airplanes. I think there's truth to that. I don't think Thiel is completely wrong, but Virilio comes in and says, no, actually the computer is the ultimate car. It's the ultimate mobility machine because you can go anywhere in the world without moving. Isn't that like the ultimate transportation? Like, isn't the digital like the ultimate transportational world? Because you can literally stay in the pod and go anywhere you want, right? And if you think of it that way, and you think about military thinking as being about the control of mobility, making moats, navies, it's a lot about mobility, then then military strategy is absolutely still being employed. It's just being employed to actually make us not move, but giving us an ultimate sense of mobility, so we're not actually very much aware that we're immobilized. Because militarily, there's always an interest in immobilizing the enemy, right? Keeping them from moving, keeping them from operating, like keeping them frozen, right? Well, if that's what we think, there's a way in which we have been frozen. And in that sense, it's the ultimate military technology. And if that's the case, then we actually have never gone beyond the thematic military thinking. It just was digitized, it became subtle, and it became something that we enjoyed because it gave us access to all these different videos or different things or whatever. And so we don't realize that strategy that has been used. But actually, if Plato is right, could lead to an inability to be fully rational or fully human or different things. But more can be said. But let me give it to Mr. Samuel Barnes in Cheetah. Mr. Barnes, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Hey guys. Yeah, I think the separation between form and function, or I guess utility and aesthetics, is really interesting. I'm not much of a physical specimen myself. I'm definitely not a boxer. More of a lover than a fighter. But it's very clear that and I would be like an old man about this and say, oh, it's to do with movies and Instagram. People always have the Adonis body, but there's a reason why they call it the Adonis body, right? Like the kind of the aesthetic ideal is something that goes back as long as we've had aesthetics, basically. But just the kind of example I'm going to bring up is, like you said, someone who's very chiseled and has certain muscles they've targeted to get a certain look is probably very good at being an amateur in a lot of different sports. But just one example, this is this swimmer, right, called Kristen Blumenfeld. He has a gold medal in an Olympic triathlon. He has the highest ever oxygen uptake recorded. And he's not got a dad bod, but he's like lean. But like he's like, I think you could describe his like physique, aesthetically speaking, as like unremarkable. But this guy would like toast anyone in any sort of swimming, running, cycling competition, man. Like he would destroy you. And it's so weird. Like that one really funny comment I saw when someone kind of pointed this out was that, oh man, he's got an outy belly button that's going to cause so much drag when he's swimming. It's just like so. And another example of this is I saw it was Tyson Fury, I think, had a weigh-in at some point. And me, like from an outside perspective, like you see it and you're like, oh, maybe it's kind of like a dad bod, but like in another part of me was like, man, that is like peak Anglo. That is the body that kept people off of the British shores for 1,000 years after the Romans had them quaking in their sandals, man. But yeah, I just think it's really, really interesting, that disconnect between form and function, because I think that's, it's apparent in the real world, and it's not just apparent in the human body, it's apparent in aesthetics. I mean, brutalism is a very obvious example of that, where form did not follow function, and people did want to be in those buildings because they're ugly, basically. So it's very, very strange. And I suppose another example, to bring it back to what Owen's been writing about, is the Iron Dome, right? Israel, right? It has it's a very futuristic sounding, very futuristic looking, has that we're going to put this security blanket around the country and protect us. And it's great if you're dealing with disposable, from a military perspective, disposable and cheap drones with little bombs strapped to them. But you can't stop a ballistic missile with the Iron Dome. So, but yeah, I don't know, just some thoughts there. I hope that wasn't too off topic, but I found it quite funny.
No, it's actually very interesting, because as you were saying that, it's kind of funny to think, if you walked out, I mean, this is kind of to, I think, Owen's work and really, but if I walked out into a random American city, it would not strike me as militarily or there's any threat versus walking somewhere where the army is everywhere. You see soldiers, but actually you're probably like a sitting duck in an American city. You would be instantaneously taken out if the government wanted you, right? With the technologies they have. And in a way, if you can see the soldiers with the guns, this is where it's like that idea of this person who doesn't look very fit is actually extremely fit. Like there's a way in which if you're in a nation where the military control is visible, you might actually have a better chance because you can escape it, you can run. But if it's like incredibly technologically advanced, then it actually may be more invisible. And I think that is like, that kind of describes a lot of what modern modernity has been. It's been making the most important things increasingly hard to see. Like I think of that line at the end of Cosette's Waiting for Barbarians. It's that lovely, he's a South African fiction writer. He wrote, he won the Nobel Prize sometime. But it was the idea that there's this character that says, there's something I've been looking at my entire life, but I can't see it. And the character, one of the main characters in the story is a girl. She has burn marks in the center of her eyes, so she can't see what's straight in front of her. Even though she's not blind, but she can't see what's directly in front of her. And there's a way in which that kind of describes how we are now. We can see things, but not the things in front of us. We can see like what the effects are of the lack of the thematic, but we can't see the thematic because it's not really intelligible to us today because of the kind of education we have, unless we're, you know, people who read Plato and hang out in spaces like this, right? Like there's a way in which the military is everywhere, but it's nowhere at the same time following this kind of ideas. And it's just very interesting where it seems like a trick in the world today is the capacity to see the invisible, or to know that the invisible is there and necessary, even if it's not in front of you, which of course, and then I'll give it to Chitan here, is very, very unnatural. Human beings have never been very motivated by the abstract, by an idea versus an experience. Like if I see a threat, I'm really good at responding to it. If I don't see a threat, but someone tells me there is a threat, I'm much more complacent. So that it's interesting, like that's so much of, I think, the challenge today is being aware of important things that you don't have experiences of as vividly as other things. And yet just knowing that, and that might be where philosophy as a training or is important, because it can kind of train you to be able to keep in mind things that are not given into experience. At the same time, it could tempt you to try to answer the meta question forever and get nowhere. So there's a ditch there based on Mr. Barnes' wonderful work in the Iconoclast. So everything is hard, but you know, that's what makes it fun. But let me give it to Mr. Chitan here. Chitan, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well.
Hi, it's been long. I've not been attending this and I was missing it actually. I've been giving job interviews and writing my PhD thesis. Very boring things. Yeah, so I haven't submitted yet, so it's going to take another month or so, I think. Now, it's very interesting discussion, and I'm sort of wondering around this problem of wages that you sort of brought up. And I think one of the interesting things about wages, and I don't know if I understand all of it correctly because my domain is not economics in that sense, and I always look at economics from some sideways angles because I always escape reading it in its own discourse more often than not. But wages is an interesting problem because there is something about the problem of wages that it doesn't get solved even when they increase. Say Marx actually understood that problem and he sort of recognized it that even if you increase wages, what you actually are increasing is more slave time. What you're increasing is, so simple increase of wages actually doesn't really, in any senses, find a necessary problem of, or understand the problem of capitalism. And normally we keep on talking about increase of wages as a measure of, how good our economics is functioning. The other thing that economics does, which I think connects back to this problem, which I think Alinka Sopanchik very brilliantly pointed out in her book, What is Sex? That economics sort of functions in this split between an other which we can enjoy from and a sexless other. So we have created this split that enjoyment can come from one source and and there can be an other which can be completely devoid of all enjoyment in that sense. And that split that necessarily in some senses causes this tension at all points of time back again, that we do not have categories to think about what that split does to us, and then we slip into these kind of ideas that maybe wages can solve the problem, maybe competition can solve the problem, maybe, because economics necessarily in modern, at least modern economics, is necessarily masturbatory in nature. It has what you may call drive-like tendencies in that sense. And what do we do with drives? We can ask those questions, but it necessarily it always links back to itself. It always escapes a relationship with the other. In that sense, and this is where I think Joachim's question of form and function sort of comes back into play in a different form. That how do we think through this problem of the economics becoming, or capital becoming, finding its masturbatory tendencies back with capital in that sense. When you look at Marx's formula MCM, money, capital, money, and that the whole idea was this self-essential nature of capital. That capital very actively combusts or excludes any other forms of relationship outside of itself. It will only relate to something else as long as something else helps it relate it back to itself, enjoy itself back again. Else, it will very actively exclude things from its own. And we don't have a sort of concrete grasp of this kind of a problem, because we are functioning in some senses as a negotiation between okay, fine, with others we can find other kinds of relationships than capital, but capital doesn't allow that. We know that capital sort of takes as much space as possible. So all other relationships gets co-opted by capital at one point or the other. It's not possible that we can, and there have been good economists, Amartya Sen for one, who have been trying to think about, okay, how do we disentangle this web? How do we give capital its correct place? And Marx's point was that that can never happen in modern capitalist economy. Whatever you will do, you'll find that problem back again, coming back placed in that situation. And my question then, and I've been trying to think about this question through the column of entropy. So my point was that when other gets escaped, the entropy of the system increases so much that living beings can't exist within that system. You have to become something of a non-life to become part of that system in some senses, isn't it? You have to become something like an object. You cannot exist as a subject. Negentropic space becomes reduced drastically, which is why you can see AI coming up. You can see all kinds of technological sort of advancements taking up that space where life sort of should exist. In that sense, I'm just sort of raising that problem openly and seeing where you sort of place, those thinkings within this. Yeah, thanks.
I think that's outstanding. That was all magnificent. I think first off, it should note that coming at economics from the side is actually extremely important if you want to see its inescapability, right? If there's this notion that it has a masturbatory structure, you're probably not going to see that in it. There's something about coming from the side that actually is quite important to see how it is kind of feeding itself in its own ways. And I meant to mention this earlier, but you see, Jock can do the boxing and Trossi and I can do the sword fighting, because Trossi over there is one heck of a sword fighter. So that's really freaking fantastic. And to me, what's also so problematic in economic studies is that there generally is a conflation of the categories. I said of wages and profit, certainly, but like if we take wealth as technology, maybe I should say instead, let's say it this way: wages, profit, and technology as a general category. Like those three, you're led to believe go up together, or they feed one another. They do not. They freaking do not. This is a big deal, because so what do they talk about in economics as creating value? Scarcity, generally. Now, we critique that with Ivan Illich, but there's an idea that if something is scarce, it is worth a lot of money, right? Well, that means in order to make wages go up, you need to make people scarce, right? You either have to have a lot of them die, they go off to war, it's limited immigration, and all the things that hurt globalization, right? Well, high wages, the conditions that make wages go high hurt globalization, that brings up profits. And then, of course, if profits aren't high, that means there might be lower wages, even if there's a higher percentage of wages, right? And globalization also seems to create that global capital that you're saying, Chita, that actually, for some reason, Well, we argue in belonging again, it tends to lose the conditions of creating demand only to stimulate demand, so entropy sets in because it becomes a stable state, right? In order to have negentropy come in, you seem to need the conditions that increase wages, which are the conditions of making humans scarce, historically speaking. Well, that doesn't sound good. How can we somehow make human beings more valuable without making them more scarce? Well, one of the ways you can do it is, say, to increase your skills or to gain your abilities so that the job market wants you. Well, yeah, there you go. Amazon, they have to compete. We said that earlier. Like there's this competition for certain workers who have certain abilities, and that's why wages go up, right? But then that just means in that field. What about all the wages outside of that field? And what if like AI begins doing that without the human element? Well, then wages plummet again. Okay, and then we say, well, then we're gonna, and this is to Cheaton's point, I'll give it back to you, Cheaton. It's like, well, let's solve it with universal basic income. Let's just give me like the magic tooth fairy. Wages will go up, we'll take care of it, right? Oh, it's exactly what you say. Like all wages has ever done is created more time to make wages. All it has done is created more of a, it's like Keynes, when they were writing back then about the, 3-hour work week or something, they're like technological innovation means we're gonna work. No, doesn't seem that way, because there's something about the sum that has wages keeps chasing its own tail, and it never actually gets out of that problem. Now, this is where technology is interesting, because technology seems like it can offer goods that increases people's well-being, but this is where it gets complicated. I'll pause before saying all that, and let me just give it back to Cheaton here. But I think what you're getting at, Cheaton, on this entropic tendency of profits that need something negentropic that maybe is shown as wages, but then wages tend to result in some need to make humans scarce, which that doesn't seem good. And then isn't AI going to like ultimately like make humans scarce? But you know, maybe there's a difference between scarcity and erasure at that point. But let me give it to you, Cheaton, please.
I'll just quickly sort of connect this back to this problem that we know, say, in modern capitalist society, even the overall wealth actually does increase. There's no away from it. The Panchik sort of points out.
Yeah.
The problem happens that the increase of wealth is sort of countersided by this rapid increase in inequality. That capital concentrates in specific positions. So it's not simply. I think it's more interesting to think about. You're right that wages in some senses do not find this linear or direct or linear relationship with, say, profit and wealth in that sense. It never does. What generally happens is wages does increase in capitalism. There's no denying that reality. But what happens is that there's a lag over there. And that lag is extremely interesting, which is where the point of Philip's point of fictitious capital come into place. That there are many other instruments, financial instruments in gaining power in our times. We need to think about that once the wealth increases, the whole backdrop in which we were thinking about those wages themselves change. It's not simply that what is a good wage today is a good wage tomorrow also. The whole background in which we understand the idea of wage itself radically shifts as capitalism goes through different stages. And that is always clouded by a lot of fictitious capital, in some senses, which covers up our own notions and ideas of what you may call good life. So for instance, what life my father could have had in X amount of rupees. I may be having, I may have an idea of, say, 100x from that in terms of that salary. But my own quality of life is, the question of my quality of life completely gets reinterpreted in today's time. I cannot, in some senses, connect back to what he was living to what I'm living today. There is no connection between those two things. I have to find my own. So the wage itself has no standard for, in some senses, or no point of comparison with the past. The past always gets completely reinterpreted and revamped as capitalism goes through different stages. And that's an extremely interesting problem to think about, because we don't have a reference point anymore, because we don't have an other over there. We don't have an adequate reference point from which these kind of measurements can take place. And thus, at each point of time, we are only chasing our own tail, as you rightly said it. And that's interesting. And I'm not against increasing wages. I think wages should increase definitely for all practical purposes. But I'm just saying that is not an adequate measure of the nature problem we are dealing with in some sense, you know.
That is outstanding. Well, and in Aspasia, it is a delight to see you. Everyone, Aspasia is absolutely outstanding, and her talk with Michelle was wonderful. And every time I've spoken with her, it's been outstanding. So it is wonderful to see you, Aspasia. It's a complete delight. And I think in the same way that with Koratani, I really like the idea, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber and then anyone else who likes to speak. Then we have to talk about the capital nation state as a whole. We have to think about wages, profits, and wealth as distinct and yet always related with hyphens between them. It's almost like you want to say wage, hyphen, profit, wealth or something. And I struggle with going on wealth and technology because I think, like, for Dietrich Miklowski, like, what she wants to stress is, sure, there's inequality, but you today have air conditioning where people 500 years ago did not. And that technological, like, advancement is a real form of wealth. Like, there is real wealth there. And so it's like you almost want to say wealth is the thing you're standing on that's going, look at my little guy. Wow, look at my little finger guy. He also does tricks. You see, he does little kick shows and different things. So wealth is this thing that's lifting. And profit and wages are happening on profit is here, wages are lagging profit, but then the profit is relative to what gives you a sense of creating wealth. And so there's a feedback loop going on, right? But capitalism has increasingly figured out ways to convince you that your wealth is increasing. That is not. That's the game, right? Like if we're like, crap, we don't know how to do stuff that's obviously generating wealth, like air conditioning. That's pretty obvious because I can tell you we've had a few 100-degree days in Virginia, and I'm like, oh, this is bad, because we actually, our friends are here, and we had to, we figured the luggage would not fit in the car. So we had to somehow get it on the top of the car. Now everyone may know this. It turns out when a car roof has been under 100 degrees for about 10 hours, it will literally burn the skin off your arm. And as the skin of my arm was being burned off, I thought about how lovely the invention of sleeves and gloves and air conditioning were, none of which were available to me at that time. That would have been an example where a clear increase of wealth would have been one of these things that would have helped me keep my skin. So what happens is more and more, as you say, get the low-hanging fruit, there's a sense where people are like, crap. How do we convince them we're increasing wealth? How do we do it? How do we Instagram, pictures, cuddly things? And you're like, oh, great, my wealth is going up. But this is where Francis Fukuyama, I think, made a mistake. Well, not a mistake, but an incomplete. It's complicated. He's kind of really weird. He's really interesting, actually. You get to the end of that book, on the end of history and the last man, it's kind of sad and tragic and stuff. He's like, I guess we're just going to consume stuff, and that will be it. It's much more interesting. He's not like, yay, the end of history and this kind of gun-ho thing. It's much more like sad. Jacob Kashir's got the fedora. Look at that fedora. Jacob Kashir, one and only. He's downstairs in the basement. And they're making marinara sauce, so it's going to be really great. Michelle, your marinara sauce just smells delightful. That would actually be real wealth. The inequality is that you guys will not get it. We will, but the wealth of the world has increased because that recipe has been added to the collective consciousness of what is now possible for people to make, and we will profit from it. So that's a good example. But this triplex of relationship is very important. I think what you're saying there, Chetan, is very important, and this is where really creating the conditions of facilitating creativity and innovation is very important, because otherwise we have to do a kind of propaganda of wealth to convince people that it's going up, and just when actually it may not be, and that could have various pathological problems. So I'm just very interested that in economics, categories like wage, profit, and wealth are conflated when they actually seem distinct, and really getting that clear on the interplay and the complicated relationship between those things may help us theorize in much more useful manner. So I agree, but let me give it to Luber, Mr. Shen, and then Mr. Jocka. Mr. Luber, please.
So, not this net, but the net before, when you and I were talking for a while. I mean, this is clearly related to that conversation. I'm just trying to piece that conversation with what's being said right now and some of my own thinking. So with this, with Philip's idea of the Olympics, I have no doubt we would have people in the liminal web that would participate in that. But the question is, are we just sacrificing potential, like, by us doing that, we're not doing other things like some other side hustle or something that's accumulating the money for us to have a better life in the immediate right now. So are we sacrificing that in order to create a space where the possibility of a new economics will emerge? So my question is, does there need to be a sacrifice, like, in order for a new economics to emerge? And then, okay, can you answer that real quick, and then I'll keep going?
Yes.
Okay. Something about that's not good. Like, something about that is like really bad in a way. Like, I'm just crazy. That's the whole point. I guess that is the whole point. The butt of the joke, like you were saying in the last conversation. Okay, so if that is the case, the more people that are doing the risk, the more likely it's a new economic system. Is that also the case then? Yes. Okay. So the name of the game then is convincing people. So, okay, this is what I'm thinking. Is the purpose of religion in order to gather people to convince them of a new possible economic system? If that is the case, that is the weirdest interpretation of religion I've thought of or heard, like, in an explicit way. Sorry, go ahead, Daniel.
So that's exactly what I was speaking with Michelle Bowens about 2 days ago, who does the peer-to-peer on the global commons and all that stuff with Smackenberg and different people. Like, this was an unintentional. You know how in Chesterton's fence, there's the idea that if you see a fence and you don't know what it does, you shouldn't remove it. Where the modern mind, if you see something you don't know why it's there, you're like, oh, we should get rid of it. We don't know why it's there. Turned out, religion was, without us maybe knowing it, dealing with some of the most severe game theory Nash equilibrium problems in all of society that we didn't know were being addressed, and then we got rid of it, and all those problems have emerged. And one of them is the fact that the social imagination that makes wealth possible has to occur outside the economy, that once the economy emerges, makes it seem like you don't need that non-economic space by which to be possible. So, the way Karatani in his new book is talking about, he talks about spirits. In Call Planier, there's the idea that you had to create the idea of the market economy outside in the market society, then move to the market economy or vice versa. The space outside the economy is what makes it possible to create the imagination of the economy. And so that's something that religion absolutely did. And it is not by chance that every economic model, like the major economies of areas, reflect the theologies of the nearby religions. The presence of interest, the presence of certain work at the commodity form. They are strongly tied to the nearby theology. And you would say, well, that's just because of that was corrupt. Most people interpret that, and then I'll give it back to you, and is the idea they say, oh, the economics was so pure and it was corrupted by the theology external to it that changed the correct operation. No. The economics is with the theology. It is not accidental to it. It has to bring in something metaphysical for its own possibility. But that also means the other thing to it is, in order to create a new economic society, you need not merely risk, but risk of risk. Meaning you have to take a risk that other people may not even see as a risk, just stupid. You're not even sure if it's a risk, because you're not even sure if what you're doing is creating, okay, it wasn't a risk. You bought a puppy. It's fine. This was all worth it. There was no risk. It was actually paid off. Oh my gosh, it's licking your lips. You just let it kiss you and didn't even like budge. You were just like, lick my lips. We do this all the time. It was really adorable. So there's really this idea that in capitalism, there's risk, equity, starting a business, there's a kind of risk, but then actually there's a risk of risk, if you will, which is the macro, where you take a risk that is the entire risk you're doing isn't even have any possibility of value, right? At least when you buy stocks, there's a possibility of value, even if you lose it. New economic social imaginations have to risk that, in a sense, they're not even risks that could generate value, right? There's like a double meta. I almost want to, oh, here it comes, meta risk, Yeah, I threw meta. There it was. We got our meta quota. There's a meta risk necessary for new economic imaginations, not merely risk. But let me give it back to you, Mr. Luber.
Okay, so now, okay, I'm definitely seeing the picture. This is really relevant to what I'm reading with Shelling. It's actually crazy. I don't like. I'll write the book in the group chat when I don't have this little guy in my arms. But this just sounds like philosophical religion. The problem that I'm having is, okay, let's persuade a new Olympics, or let's a new gathering place, right? And we can frame it as this quasi religion economics. Like, we're intentionally aware of this dynamic at play. The problem I have is we'll be able to convince some people, like the secular people, you're tired of the economic system that you're in, join this economic system. But then you do that, the people, like, I have friends that are devout Catholics. They're like, well, that's not why I'm doing that. Like, that's almost like anti-religious in their mind. So I guess the name of the game is how to persuade both without cutting off the other. And that is where I guess storytelling comes in, because you have to have a convincing, like, unfolding. And I guess I'm just thinking out loud, like, a lot of philosophy, like, it got to the point in philosophy where it sees life, like it got to Heidegger, where it's like, okay, life's an unfolding. Like, let's understand the enduring feature of concepts. In that sense, there's this unfolding of concepts, unfolding of ideas. And it wasn't necessarily always explicit, where it's like it's an unfolding and not this static way of approaching something. So I see the philosophical progression, and then, like, with Jockin's work with beauty just is about showing how it's like unfolding. That's always like a surprise, like probably more of an emphasis on the surprise aspect to beauty, the beauty part. But I guess okay, so I guess we have there needs to be a religion that acknowledges the economic, such that you're like, if you participate in this economic system, then the possibility of God to come may happen. And, like, I guess that would be the loop around, where it's like you can bring in the secular by virtue of just like the immediate need of a new economic system. And then you bring in the religious, the already religious, by explaining the economic system in which you're in isn't helping your religion, such that the God to come is less likely to come. So it becomes like a likelihood on that end. I guess, and I'll just leave it off with this. Is this just like some type of like part of game theory? Is it just a game where it's like, okay, we just are here right now and we need to figure out some rationale to have the best here right now? And, like, we could call, some hope, some promise part of this, like, religious dimension. And that hope and promise has everything to do with puts you in the position to even have a hope and promise. And the putting yourself in the position for that hope and promise is the economic system. Like, the economic system is what gives you the gas, so to speak, for you to drive to church, So, like, my reason why I'm saying this, and I'll pass it off, is just, if it is the case that religion and economics has this like deep intimate relationship, then people might have like a very, very nihilistic point of view, where it's like, this is just a game. There is no There's nothing, there's no like real bestowing. Like they're like, what is special? Like the question to me of like what is special becomes like a very important question, because it seems like special becomes, in a certain sense, arbitrary for the best possible now. And that's not special in a certain sense, because special, there's a certain sense of longing in being special. Like there's a certain longevity. Like it's not just what's special isn't just what's special now, but it's what's to come is also going to be special because it is special. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, and just like what does special mean if we were to really take this paradigm seriously?
Yeah. No, that's delightful. First off, Reed really likes Heidi, so you need to hold Heidi up so Reed can see. There it is, Reed. You see the puppy. He's so happy. Look how happy he is. There he is. He's smiling. He's so big. Also, I think for Espacito, it might be 4 in the morning or 5 a.m., so you're a real one, and Cheeton is like 2 in the morning or something. You guys are great. There's a few things. So this is also great on the risk, because we were talking in the kitchen with Michelle on this idea of the difficulty of a parent where you have to accept risk, but you want to keep your parents from risk. And then there's also like the risk, the meta risk. I'm just going to call it meta risk. If you throw meta in front of a word, you're always safe. So meta risk. So, you know, that's that kind of idea. And then also, so Mr. Luber.
Sorry, real quick. And like to add on to the question of special, like as a parent, like I would love Michelle's take and your take on this, and anyone who has kids take. Like you want to make your kids feel special. Like you as a parent feel special by making your kids feel special, I feel like. So like I feel like this paradigm diminishes that possibility, because everything in a certain sense seems fixed. But sorry,
no, it's very good. So you either make people realize that economics, you either add economics and religion together, or you make people realize that economics was always already religious. You add specialness to people, or you make them realize they always already were special, right? So there's an always already in operation here, and that's the key. Economics is very theological and metaphysical, right? Like there's this thing, like what did Agon say? God didn't die, he became money. There's always a very profound relationship between economics and religion. So we're not talking about making people realize, like add religion to economics, but the metaphysical character of everything already, and that the divide between the quote unquote practical and the impractical is a false divide. That whatever we define as practical is already situated within a certain metaphysical horizon of value, which makes me think of what Mark, Gaffney, and Stein talk with the opening of the eye of value. And I did enjoy that book. I thought that was lovely. So, but let me sum it up this way. And actually, this gets into what Jacob and I were talking about in the kitchen a little bit. So there's this idea of right now is the world where there's this question of, is everything a game? And you see, when you ask it that way, it feels very arbitrary, right? It feels like silly. Game equals arbitrary. And if a teacher tells you everything is a game, then you get that knowledge and it feels arbitrary. But what if you were to just suddenly find yourself dancing without thinking of it as a game? You just were doing the dancing. You wouldn't ask it. It wouldn't feel nihilistic. In fact, it would be exhilarating. So in an age, you know, there's a lot of theological traditions where heaven is a dance, that it's all play, like Eden, children, garden. There's this notion that the meaning of life is joy. Well, joy sounds like a game, or a certain sort of experience of everything in a game-like way. But if you think about everything being a game, it feels arbitrary. But what if you suddenly always already found yourself in a game setting? Well, the arbitrary suddenly becomes the freedom of play. Something must be arbitrary to be freeing. But as long as you don't think about it as arbitrary, you're full body in it, the arbitrary turns out to be the condition. A dance is always arbitrary, but it's very ordered. It's not chaos. It's not random. It's very meaningful precisely because it could not be. It could not be. And yet it is, because you're in it. So what we need today is, instead of teachers, we need facilitators. People who facilitate environments where you find yourself always already in the game. Not thinking about things as a game, but in the game, which of course sounds like propaganda, but what if reality is joy? What if ontologically things are a dance? Then it's not arbitrary, it's alignment with actuality, which then if there's a relationship between dance and beauty, because I'm using dance here, but dance is a kind of play, a kind of beauty, right? You are the logos realization of reality as seemingly all being a game is the invitation to sacrifice the logos as dominant, to enter into the thymotic eros and logos together in dance, where you stop letting logos have the dominant say and you move into a participatory knowing. Vervaeke emphasizes the participatory, which is when you are suddenly in the dance, the phenomenology of the artist versus the product of the artist, which then changes the logos feeling of it being a game into an invitation of the fullness of life. And if life ultimately isn't about joy, what is it about? Who cares? So actually that facilitation into that joy, into that freedom of the dance is precisely what beauty is calling you to do. And that's why when you have the experience, the strike of beauty, you feel that invitation to move into it. And the more you move into it, the more you feel like you're entering into a dance and joy. But what is it that keeps you from entering into that invitation? Everyone take Jockin's class, I'm coming. What is it that keeps you from doing that? The feeling of beauty is arbitrary. Beauty is subjective. A game is arbitrary. It's just a game. And so you look at that invitation to dance and you say, oh, it's just a dance, it's arbitrary. And so you condemn yourself to being cast out into the darkness and you call it enlightenment. And it's very difficult to escape darkness if you call it enlightenment. But let me give it to Philip Shen, Thomas Jockin, and then Chiton. Mr. Shen.
Well, it sounds like in the objective fictions that Zizek talks about. And to knowing that the game we're almost always playing is in language. At least the ones that were like kind of, like David Foster Wallace, Fish and Water, the ones that were like, oh no, that's not, I didn't know that was going on. And it makes me think some of, what's this guy's name? Carl Hayden Smith's work with hyperhumanism, where he's talking about this DMTX, this idea of, just dreaming in our life being about an experience of psyche. And how can we find beauty there if we don't have some kind of facility with language? And one of the things Jockin was saying about memory, I think it still applies, at least in like the TikTok generation sense. Like I can tell a different quality of conversation with someone who has spent their teens and 20s watching hundreds to thousands of 10-second videos a day versus someone who just hasn't and engaged in more kind of like long form conversations. And I don't know, when it comes, I want to talk about this profit and wages stuff as well. Because like comparing to the last generation, like for me, it'd be the boomers, as far as what would you call it, purchasing power. I'm not sure it's like anything but a guaranteed route to depression, unless you're making like $500,000 a year. Because there's like a part of me that is like, if I take McCarricker's thesis seriously, I'll just read Walden 2 and like B.F. Skinner, just cut my hours in half. I'll work 20 hours a week. I'll get 22 an hour. I'll eat the same thing. I'll live, in a cheap part of town. I might not have the greatest chance of passing on my genes, but whatever. And I'll basically just have all this leisure where I can think, I can write, I can create, and I can see the machinations of the societal apparatus, and say, I'm gonna pick which game, and I'm gonna live with the consequences. I will have the meta awareness that I'm still better off than 90% of humans on this planet, simply because of where I was born. As far as a creature comfort perspective goes, I might have to give up some of the, whatever you want to call it, keeping up with the Joneses. I might have to give up some of my Protestant work ethic. I might have to give up some of my givens as far as like providing and protecting as gender goes. but it's not that it's impossible. So I wonder sometimes if this is sort of like the realm of imagination to be in, where it's like wages going down is kind of only a problem if like you have a society who's like one of their biggest GDP categories is like the medical industry. Also, if like housing is an appreciating asset that more and more is being bought up by REITs. And so then the question would be like, well, why would you try to make individual advancement instead of seeking to enact some kind of policy change that says something like, you know, you can only make this much money off of housing, you can only make this much money off the medical complex, because that to me seems like first of all, a much more difficult question, but also it might be, if man has one ultimate measure, it might be death. And religion and the secular have things to say about that. If there's any chance that it's a continuation of consciousness, you know, in a way, you could think, you know, what is it going to be like for my children and their children and et cetera, based on the themos that could be possibly gained by changing, you know, low wages not necessarily being like a death sentence in this kind of society.
No, I think those are wonderful comments, and I'll pass it on to Mr. Jockin. Can do that. I think the marinara sauce will be done in about 30 or so minutes, or dinner will be, or at least my need to eat the marinara sauce that Michelle is making will be in 30 and so minutes, so I'll probably in about 30 go. But this has been wonderful, so a few things come to mind. First off, this is where there's this kind of idea, this is why Karatani, and then also Studebaker, on the idea of changing laws or the capital. Like, if you go into the state to change the law to affect housing, the market's going to run in, then the nation's got fascism's going to save the day, or the government is so locked down with K Street, government's in, Jonathan Routes, and all that different stuff, it's all kind of stuck, right? So at that point, you either curl up in a ball with your marinara sauce and eat it and just pretend like everything's fine, or you go down and maybe it's like Milton, where you feel like, you know, you're going to lose against God, but you debate this like rebellion and hell. It's like, we'll go down with a fight, you know, for who would lose, so full of pain, these intellectual beings, we're going to take that guy out, distill a sound in motion, you know, that may be the strategy as well. And you see that, this kind of like doomer frustration, like who cares? And this is the fourth Caramosa brother that I don't think is talked enough about and Daniel Zaruba has made this point. There's actually 4 Caramosa brothers, not just Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha, but Smemilkov, who is the Joker character. He's the one out of Redlock, and he's like, screw it, just burn it all down. I'm going to kill the dad. I don't care. Like, he's like, burn it down. And when you get into a state like this, it's the 4th brother, because each of those brothers represent a possible direction of modernity for Mr. Dostoevsky. But the 4th brother is the one that comes out later, where if you don't freaking figure this out, the Joker's showing up, and he's like, yeah, just burn it, I don't care, it's fun. And that is the German nihilism, not the French, dare I say, French nihilism, but that is the German nihilism of what versus the kind of nihilism that's the hopeless sort of just curl up in a ball coming up. So I think that's really kind of important. So if that is all so, and then I'll give it to Jockin and Teton, what is the realm of operation? So you're talking about wages going down, and what if we were to see that as not a problem? Well, the moment you see wages not as the be all, you're kind of automatically outside the logic of capital, right? Like, if you ask the question, is wages going down actually, like, do I need higher wages? You've entered into a new social imagination. And that's the key. Because if you can't affect the capital nation state, this is why you mentioned right at the beginning the objective fiction. Sociology should be the study of the creation and spread of objective fictions in history. You know, that's what we try to argue in Belonging Again. You know, capital raced in and kind of hid the question. But objective fictions whether it be in the Indo, the Japanese, Christianity and silence, whether it be distinctions. I know Dave has been talking about him, Philip Reeve, all these different things. What is the realm in which new social imaginations are created that then can change how people operate, that then they find more joy in? And actually, the contradiction and like tension between profit, wages, and wealth, as we've been talking about, could actually be an invitation to think the realm of creating objective fictions versus let's go in there and fix it, because that's just playing into the hand of the capital nation states. Like, come on, try to fix it because you're going to blow something up. And so you say, no, there's something there that we have to, which means we need to think the social imagination, which are spaces outside the market like the Olympics you're describing. That literally is thinking new social imagination that changes new forms of subjectivity. That, funny enough, my other argument is if you actually go through history, that actually is what creates wealth and happiness and things. That's the great joke, is that the economic triplex that I'm describing is a result of changes of social imagination, and then it forgets the origin. Just like Heidegger talks about. Like, there's a forgetting of what made this possible. Yes, Charles Taylor has a book on the social imagination. I think he had one now on like enchantment or different thing. Charles Taylor, Secular Age. He's all about this. Peter Berger, all of these different people. That realm of trade-off sociology or tragic sociology is what we need to think today. And if you take that seriously, and you take seriously that that is what actually leads to wealth, then the fact that there is some sort of contradiction between those three suddenly just becomes a invitation to reclaim the origin that was lost, and then to facilitate people who are exploring that origin and always already in it, which would be the experience to have the strike of beauty. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin, Cheetown, and then Mr. Looper. Mr. Jockin.
This is great stuff, everybody. I mean, one thing, is Looper still here?
He's always here in our hearts. Always.
In our hearts.
If you see
He's
him,
here.
Okay.
he's right
Yeah,
here.
his camera's off,
right
his hands up.
here.
All right, cool. No, because he's asking this because his reflection on the religious and economy. I mean, immediately, I brought up my notes, the economy of salvation. It's doctrinal from the Catholic Church. So the word for economy, right, this kind of like divine economy, has been part of the theological project of many traditions for a very long time. So I think, Daniel, your argument actually has a historical basis, right, built in from there. So this is not surprising at all, basically, this intuition or consequence. I do have a couple of notes about that, because actually a big tension part is that, notice that, so built in that argument, there's a very clear ordered good that everything was oriented against or around, right? The good of salvation, the everlasting safe salvation of your soul. That's what the divine economy was for. It had a very clear synchronization around that good. And I'm just reminded from talk about my course with Symposium, there's a really fascinating line in there where it's presented that that love is the desire for everlasting possession, right? And the argument is presented by Diotima, presenting this to the younger Socrates, is that the everlasting possession of the good is what gives man happiness, which is supposedly the end goal, the end for its own sake of human existence is happiness, eudaimonia. There's an end, but there's a question. But right prior to that, that was the conclusion, and then they go forward from that argument, from that presentation in the Symposium. What would then be the everlasting desire for possession of the beautiful? Right, to kind of riff on this point, there is no answer. It cannot be. It's not answered. And then Diotima does a switch. Say, okay, what about the good? And that happened because prior in the Agathon intervention, a kind of discussion with Socrates, Socrates has Agathon consents to the claim, is the good the beautiful? They want to collapse it together. And the answer is yes. And there's a really interesting line in there, is that let us presume that it's the case moving forward. So it's very fun. So it's like in that dialogue, there's like the great question of the collapsing of the good and the beautiful. That's kind of pulled through in the discussion with Diotima to say, well, wait a minute, if the coordination of economics around the good, what happens if there's no agreed upon good? Right, this only works when there's a coordination of a good. But what happens, and this is the argumentation of how the beautiful is a political social order mechanism, would be the addressing, or it would be the attempt at the address, right? Use from the O.G. Rose argumentation, because it's the only, if once the coordination of the good is destroyed or removed or not allowed to be the coordination of everybody, what else can you use? It would be the beautiful. Of course, that's such a huge project because then we don't know what that is. And we don't know what that would be the consequence of that. So I'm just riffing on those points. I say that because I'm thinking of this notes of like kind of social imagination, what seems stupid or useless, or like that point. To give a counterpoint, they kind of draw out a point about this. Web3, crypto. That's fascinating because I would make the argument, the problem with it was oriented around goods. It was about the good of decentralization, of personal choice, of autonomy, right? It was about a coronation of the good. And that was why it was doomed to fail, because it did not have an understanding. It had this interesting intention about scale and mechanism, which I know, by the way, the Gardeners have their course, Parallax. It's on this weekend about scale. Counter shout out. I'm very excited for that course on Sunday. They were very generous and provided me access to it, which I'm very thankful for. I'm going to talk about this with that group because I think it's an interesting demonstration of where the interesting about Web3 and crypto. It was really a creative attempt at social imagination. It really was. I have to give it fairness for that. However, it failed. It did not have the kind of the revolutionary quality to it. And I think part of the reason why was because it was still oriented around good as the coordination mechanism for the activities. Like the argument was that this was going to work because of some kind of ordered good of personal self-interest and preference and autonomy and just decentralization for its own sake as being a good. I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts about that, but that's what I'm thinking about in my mind about this. And I say this because another note is that there's a huge tension point. And then I'm reading this from Zine Taleb. Distribution of things that are in a natural world, naturally occurring, usually follow normal distribution. There's only going to be a certain amount of weight, all of us range, right? No one's going to be 1 ounce, another person 2 tons. It's not going to work. There's going to be a range, likely with our height. No matter while there is variation, the amount of variation is relatively minor. There are no 500 feet tall men. At best, there's 8 foot, maybe 7 foot at best. That's the order of magnitude of difference, like versus social qualities or attributes. So the social informational dimension does have inequality of that example I'm demonstrating. These kind of orders of magnitude difference built into it. And I think that's I kind of think about that because that's part of the tension part. Because part of the thumos social status aspect, that's the thing, is that these goods that we're coordinated around, it's not about humans, it's not longer about our souls being saved for eternity, right? The social divine economy. It's about social competition, competitional mating competition, right? Social position of the Joneses. Look what's happened. The orientation of the good has just shifted right over into the material social dynamic relationships, which have a thematic kind of competitional striving dimension to it, built into it. And when we have social information dynamics and interactions, like we draw in the beginning, like when the contest no longer becomes material physical existence, which is bounded by normal distributions, right? As a kind of boundedness, natural order built into that. The social informational domain does not have that order. It's generally a parallel distribution, maybe Poisson, maybe some other distribution like that. It doesn't operate in the same domain, but yet our biology is built around that. Isn't that interesting? So that's the tension point. And our social interactions are having these layered abstractions of interactions that are oriented around this distribution. I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts about this because I think there's some strong tension. I think it's because part of our management or addressing of this is that orientation of the beautiful, but also things like, Daniel, your topic, our concept of the partial object. I think is very important here because that's partly also isn't that interesting what capital ultimately is? Like assets that give you capital, that are capital, or things that can generate work, generate activity. I say that because the contrast because any object can be oriented around, this is the kind of danger of capital, kind of which Shitan brought up, is that unfortunately under one kind of partial object of an account of capital, every object, every interaction can be a mode of capital. A hot dog can be consumed for your own consumption or survival, or you can sell it for someone and make a profit off it, as an example. Or you can rip off some example. Generally, this is what marketing advertising is built on. Like the widget's not the widget. It's also a thematic mediation of some other social domain. So this is all how I'm giving examples of how these interact with each other. But it's also this, I'm just kind of connecting with Daniel's concept of the partial object, that this is a kind of acting of counts that gives this generation of activities that were priorly not there or not aware they were there. But the more positive kind of not critiquing side of it is to say things like like social relationships and cultural norms and traditions give you a context, kind of relevance point, give you the grounding context that generate value in the first place, that allow activity to occur in the first place. So I'm not trying to in a dismissal way, but the kind of, when we look at capital as a mode of intersection of kind of looking at things, interacting with it that way, that's an example. That's the kind of danger of it, or the potential danger of it, especially when we're adding on these layers of social inequality that are built into it because they're informational and they're cultural social. So they don't have the kind of natural law of boundedness that nature naturally gives things, give an ordering to it. One last thing is also this, and I will bring this up because of the thumos desire for uniqueness. Like we want to be eminent. We want to be the only one. It's actually, it's interesting because I mean, the thing again, I'll circle around because from a theological point of view, with divine economy, the only one that's from a monotheistic Abrahamic religion point of view, the only one that is truly unique is God, right? He is the most personal. He is the only one. He is. Everyone else is just gradations of actually sameness of genericism compared to the uniqueness. So basically, the more divine you become, the more unique you become. That's kind of those line of arguments. Also, we can see as an example of some of the accounts of the angels being in extreme multiplicity. Like basically, there's like hundreds of thousands or potentially millions or billions of angels because each one is actually absolutely as unique, as different as a lion is to a goat, like the species difference. Kind of, this is the consequences of this line of thought. I'm just saying that because that's actually kind of in that interest of human beings, right? We have this thematic wish to be absolutely unique, yet we have this incredible, but we also want a community and unity at the same time. Like we're just this big bundle of contradictions built into that, attentions. That's all I just want to chew on just for today. So I'd like everyone's thoughts about some of the ideas I'm bringing up.
Delightful. And actually, it's great Aspasia's here because he's the one who taught me to say thumos instead of thymos, like a lame American boy or something. So it's perfect. No, there's a lot there. It's kind of, I'll give it to Cheeton here. It's kind of interesting because, there's that idea that every angel, I think, is their own species. Maybe there's something about the human desire to be unique that is for us to be like angels, which is not what God intended. So it creates all sorts of pathologies versus being fitting to what we are as embodied, which means, no, we're not each our own species, but that maybe allows some sort of quality of relation that is unique in the creative order, that only that it's fitting for humans to figure that out versus just seek to be their own species, because that would be for us to be angels, and that's not fitting, or if to make one kind of theological notion. I think basically on what you're saying, I'm, on this column of scale, like you said with the West book, or we talk about like where nature naturally keeps trees from getting too big, or there's no 500-foot person, but a city could theoretically get any size, right? Which could be precisely why we're accelerated to death. And Mr. Kashir noted that we should talk about acceleration today and my caffeine addiction because I'm drinking black tea and coffee at the exact same time. And it's true. I can't deny it because he saw it with his own eyes. Yeah, you see that? He's like, oh my gosh, there's no hope. So it's crazy. I saw you. I judged you. It can't be a deep fake because I saw it with my own eyes. So he knows. Like, that's going to be a business. Sending in people to confirm things that aren't deep faked. I mean, Jacob's all over that. Anyway, there's this tension here. And the reason why this is really big, in my opinion, is because if we take Leputko seriously in the Breakdown of Nations, which he's always like, the problem isn't between left and right, it's between big and small. And any good system at too big of a scale naturally fails. Rather it be capitalism, communism, it doesn't matter. And he thinks that we overly emphasize, oh, what we need is communism. Oh, what we need is capitalism. Always like, well, at any good system at any scale becomes pathological. So the problem is between big and small. This is a problem because if anything human beings make are not naturally going to scale, and any good thing at too big of a scale becomes pathological, then there is not a natural check on human creations reaching a point of causing pathologies, right? And then there's another problem. And I think Leputko has a very strong point. If anything at too big of a scale becomes a problem, then let's say we theoretically arrive at here today in the, at the greatest socio-political system known to man. You couldn't scale it. Like even the best of all, but maybe it's like we'll call it marineraism instead of capitalism and communism because Michelle is making. So maybe marineraism is the best economic system ever. Well, you couldn't scale it. Well, I guess the address is doomed, right? Because even if you could come up with the system that somehow was the best coordinator, the best government, the best voting system, the best institutions for Leopard Co., you could never scale it. Because anything that big of a system then incubates within it the kind of people who are pathological, who then are power hungry and create all sorts of problems following Hayek and the best on top and different things like that. So what do you scale? Well, this is where something like beauty and partial objects seems very important, precisely because there is something that what you are scaling is the grasping of something you can never fully grasp. And so if Leopard Co. and West is fully correct about the impossibility of scaling any human creation, the only thing that's possible to scale is some sort of partial thing, like the experience of beauty, and actually spreading the possibility of being formulated or facilitated toward that phenomenon, right? But that is something that you could never fully systemize in this way without having these unintentional consequences. And this seems to be the realm of the social imagination, because in the social imagination, it seems like you can spread the conditions of social imagination without scaling a given system to make people socially imagine. That difference is really weird, and getting a good grasp on that difference seems to be really important, because that is precisely like you're saying, it seems to be family and social relations that create the wealth that then capital comes in and kind of takes off. Yeah. Can you spread something that makes people better in those human realms that is very unique and very difficult to systemize? Because anything else you scale would become pathological, following West or Cohn or different things. There's no other possible address that can be spread that isn't on this very human level, that is also kind of hard to put your finger on, but it is precisely that difficulty to put your finger on what you're doing that is what keeps it from falling into the pathologies of scale that Leopard Co. is talking about. So if you can spread that thing that is hard to put your finger on, like beauty, then you actually could have an address without falling into these unintentional pathologies that you have seen. Well, what is that? Well, we've talked about it before, the social coordinating mechanism of the liminal web. We've talked about like changing the legal systems to unleash that, to coordinate people with the association of that. We've talked about the spread of voicecraft. We've talked about the spread of these certain ways of the subject organizing themselves in the world that would actually change the underlying basis of the capital markets, of the economy, or the ways that people carry themselves. But that is a spreading of spread. Yeah, I know, that's exactly right. That's a spreading of the conditions of that social imagination. And, you know, to the point what you were saying on Web 3.0, like talking with Mr. Barnes, and I'll give it to Cheeton here. Right now, this is how I view it, which is a giant claim I would have to justify that I will not justify because I'm a terrible human being. We are kind of at an age of realizing that every possible system or coordination mechanism or whatever cannot deal with the underlying fundamental, no matter how good it is. If it is based on the good as primary, then it won't work. And if it's based on the true, then well, what's the true other than the only agreed upon truth that you can have across pluralism basically has to be some kind of facticity, right? Otherwise, you're dealing with metaphysics and difference of taste and different things, which by the definition is the grounds of disagreement. So the only thing you could spread as the true would be basically scientism, which we tried. And there was some unintended consequences. Then we tried the truth of the commodity form, had unintended consequences, right? Well, or you could spread the good and try to make everyone neoliberal Democrats and democracy, right? Everywhere you go, people don't tend to like that because they have diversity, and then you have a terrible situation in parts of the world. Anyway, so what's left? What's left? Beauty. You know, beauty is the thing that you would somehow spread as the basis without creating these unintended consequences. So basically, I think the technology of Web 3.0 is very innovative and very powerful. Now it's at the point where we realize that it has to be for the beautiful, the spreading of the beautiful of the partial object, not the good, not the true. You could say that democratic republics are great forms of government, but they're at the point of realizing that if they're just on the basis of the good and the true, they become pathological. They need to be focused on the beautiful. So it goes with education, so it goes with family. Mr. Jockin, please.
Just to jump in on one point, I think it's a big push. I remember during the Web3 movement and NFTs was arts. Yes. But the thing was, it was a confusion of what it was aesthetic. It was not the beautiful, like just to draw that point. It didn't realize, it did not understand what the beautiful is. It was just a focus on a kind of basically literally not tokenism of the art making process and the artifact making of the asset. I just want to jump in just to add that one point because I think that's very fair what you're saying.
I think absolutely, speaking with Anthony Mortal, I'm completely convinced that there are certain coordination possibilities with Web 3.0 or the blockchain that can deal with the professional managerial class, that can deal with some various inefficiency that the capital nation state uses to exploit. But it has to be based on the beautiful. Same with everything. Like, this is that we're at the age where, like, all of these like the plausible deniability of anything other than the partial object as the basis for global society will not suffice, because it will fall into some sort of exploitative or capital nation state play or something like that. Here's our problem, though. What the heck do you mean by the beautiful? Like, the average person here is like, what are you talking about? We base a society on the beautiful. The very weirdness of the idea is precisely the defense mechanism from exploitation. But the thing only makes sense, really, if you do it. What did we say earlier? If we talk about a game and feels arbitrary and dumb and like it will never do anything. But if you have actually danced, if you've actually been in the facilitated space of the dialogos, if you've actually seen the beautiful, totally makes sense to you. But it only makes sense if you've experienced it, which, if you haven't, it sounds really weird. But that very weirdness is the advantage. That very weirdness is why it has the possibility of avoiding the pathologies of scales and being customized for every pluralistic individual, because the beauty is the objective, and yet the experience of it is unique. So it makes space for a pluralism that is connected. We were saying earlier that if we follow Earl Thompson, the problem between like profit and wages is that you need distinct nations that relate. You need some weird balance that never seems to be balanced out. Mr. Luba was saying all these different fields seem to be formulating around a very similar problem, right? Maintaining distinction and relation is a way to put it. Because if you don't have distinction, you don't have relation. But if you have relation, it threatens the distinction because you are formulated by that very relation to become the thing you are like, right? Well, then you're all the same and you lose the distinction. So now you're in trouble, right? So how do you have relation while maintaining distinction that brings people together without compromising what they are? It has to be some kind of partial object. It has to be something like beauty, something that you're orbiting, like formally, it has to be something you orbit that always is there to unify you orbiting, but maintaining distinction, but also maintaining a relation that can be the grounds of intelligibility between you because you all share that thing that you're formulating. But the very weirdness of this notion is the challenge. Like, the very weirdness of the notion is why you almost need things like the liminal web or people seeing it or getting it or the experience it. You need infrastructure that allows people to participate in it, to get it, and that really has never existed, you could argue. And it is possible that blockchain or Zoom, we were talking with Kashir, with Tim on education today, the revolution will be Zoomed because of the possibility of this new technological communication to show a different kind of interaction, a different way of facilitation outside of teaching, that could be like, oh, I get it. I get it. I see it. I can participate in it. I see how it could work. But in order to make beauty the basis of society, more so than truth or goodness, you need a technology to show the participation. And that doesn't seem like it was so possible until now. More can be said, but let me give it to Chetan and Mr. Luber. And then if anyone else has final thoughts, please, Chetan.
I'll try and be quick. And you sort of provoked me into this dialogue. The great sort of thinking around this question of economics and theology that we should think about in that sense, and Joaquin's point about salvation is, I think, extremely important. But one of the things about economics is that economics is not just any kind of salvation. That's the first point. It's about salvation in this world rather than the other world. That's, I think, the first sort of maybe wanting to think about there. That there's this transition from the other world to this world in how economics sort of thinks about salvation. Second, this question of salvation is also linked to politics. It's fundamentally linked to politics, first and foremost. In fact, if we ask the question that how did we move from politics to economics, I don't think we have a good answer to that problem. Marx tried to think about it through capital, but somehow our thinking in some senses moved from the problem of politics always was that it was a sphere where contradictions could find, a public sort of space, a public sphere in that sense. And that's how politics sort of always, emerged from in that sense. The idea of politics emerged from. At some point, we realized that these contradictions can actually be better answered in the zone of economics. And that is where capital and so on and so forth entered, which is why, and Hannah Arendt sort of thinks about this problem, I think very sort of insightfully when she says that economics is an extension of private sphere, whereas politics is an extension of public sphere. Economics privatizes things in a way which is extremely interesting. Just to maybe sort of connect this problem back to this question of theology. Today we know that our thinking about political, as far as we have secularized our politics and so on and so forth, a certain theological dimension cannot be ignored. Political theology is becoming an extremely important field to think about in contemporary, and especially when you think about this problem of quality of life, which is what sort of, the word that comes up in different ways, that our notions of quality of life are only objective notions which can be calculated through data, numbers, and so on and so forth. But we haven't thought through this problem theoretically at all. There's a very nice book by Bhrigupati Singh who's sort of trying to think about quality of life from an ethnographic point of view. And what would quality of life look like when you do it ethnographically? But that question, I think, remains in many ways. The challenge has always been that this theological dimension, this minimal excess that politics always, in some senses, kept within itself, such that boundaries within this world could be maintained and sustained. And secularization, another meaning of secularization always was that when you secularize this world, you also in some senses close this world, created to totality, such that all those boundaries could be now evaded, now be done away with, which is what modern economics, if we look at, say, Foucault's work or even Linka Zubantek's work, it was always that modern economics, far from mercantile economics, which was that a total wealth has to remain constant unless it takes from somebody else. Now modern economics can function in a manner that my wealth can grow without your wealth being increasing or decreasing. That was the fundamental change through which economics sort of handled this problem of politics, and invokes a certain theological dimension into our economics which we do not understand fully yet, I think. Because it's not simply theology as it existed before. Now, the theology earlier was this minimum excess such that our world can remain stable, and if we want to increase our wealth, we'll go and conquer another kingdom and take their wealth to increase our wealth. Something shifted, and now we can think that we can increase our wealth infinitely if we create a closed totalizing system, such that our theology can be an excess through which all boundaries can be done away with. Even politics, to a large extent, can be privatized. And that's an interesting question to sort of ponder over for me. I've been thinking about it for many years now. It comes to me every time, and I don't write, and I sort of again move over it, and again it comes back in different forms. And I just wanted to share it and see what comes out of it. Yeah, thanks.
I think that is absolutely magnificent. And I think for me, that kind of idea of if we take this thing and we totalize it, it will be like heaven on earth. Like there's kind of like a theological completion that can kind of occur there. That's almost like the evangelistic bent of economics as well. If everyone, it would be kingdom on earth. Once everyone believed in Jesus, then the earth would be saved and it would be good to go, right? So there's this kind of evangelical salvation bent to it in the economic model. The great joke that we try to, I find very interesting is as you approach totalization, as you approach internally consistency, the entropy sets in, and the Gödel point becomes, you start to see it. Like the thing, and the Gödel point for me today is lack. Oh, we have totalization. We have everything we ever wanted. Everyone is capitalism. Global capitalism is one. And yet something's not right. Well, look, everything is under this. What do you mean something? There's no something to be not right. Like everything that is something is included. So what do you mean something's not right? Well, because the thing that's not right is lack. It is the thing that's there and not there at the same time. It's not nothing because there is no nothing. Everything that is out, but everything that's included is here, and yet something is lacking. Oh, lack must be lacking. Godel point. Like that, as we had from that talk, the point of incompletion is what unveils the incompletion, but you needed that total saturation, to use kind of Ebert's language, in order to get, and beauty is kind of a fundamental Gödel point. Now, Chetan, please.
Yeah, just saying that modern capital is built upon this exploitation of the gap.
Yes.
You constantly exploit the lack in that sense. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think that's critical because when the map is indestructible, one of the things that's big is you maintain the permanency of an ideology by identifying with the Gödel point. Not that the Gödel point is like, no, that's what we exist. That's part of the totalization. That's what justifies this effort with the ever covering. Like that's part of the mechanism. No, that's an ontological revelation. It's a deeper revelation, not an accidental revelation. But you see, the problem is, since all maps consist of a kind of point of incompletion, you can include that in the ideology as the function of the ideology versus the revelation that there's a limit to what ideology can do. That's the issue. You either choose the Gödel point, the Kirk Gödel point, the function of the ideology is to address that, or you say, wait, this actually shows there's a limit to what ideology can accomplish. Maybe we need to move to participation. Maybe we need to move back to the public, the relational, right? But that's the choice. Like we said, that's the choice of the response to the Gödel point. And here, the choice is, actually, every single ideology, this is a bold claim, but hopefully the book will make, like, every ideology eventually hits a Gödel point. It eventually finds a gap. It eventually finds something that it cannot occur. Every single one of them, whether it be communism, capitalism, Christianity, doesn't matter. Every single map finds a gap. And then every single map has to decide their response to that gap. Oh, this gap is why we exist. So we need to do our thing more. We need to do our map more. Or you say, wait a minute. Every single possible map consists of a Gödel point. Maybe those gaps are actually like ontological. That's why they show up in every map. Maybe they're part of reality itself. And maybe what we need to focus on is the reality of the gap and ergo lack in every possible map versus have different strategies by which to deal with the gap. What if we were to lean into the existence of the lack as something that we need to formulate around? Now we are making the lack, if you will, primary and the map secondary versus the map primary and the lack secondary, if you will, right? That's the shift. And if you do that, and lack is in fact present as a Gödel point in every single possible map, then it could have a universal basis while maintaining the diversity and pluralism of every map. And then the question is, how do you make that lack meaningful and motivational to people? Because it's beautiful, because it's a partial object, because it's something that pulls you in. Now the lack is experienced not primarily a kind of bad thing, but it's seen instead as a kind of apophatic thing, the navel of the dream. That's beautiful, Aspasia. So that is how you see it. And then all of us in our individual maps, ideologies, et cetera, so forth, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber. And then if anyone has final things to say, everyone has the universal experience of that lack. That here's the thing. The only way to come upon that lack was through a map. So you had to go through a map that you totally saturated, a story that you followed to get to the place. But then you get to the place where you see the lack and you go, oh, the map was to get to this place of the experience of the lack, not because the map was primary. The primary was just the necessary process to go through where you could encounter this. And that lack is actually the essence, because at the essence is a beauty that then that doesn't make the map irrelevant, but shows that the map is actually part of a bigger story that is part of the different maps that has the beauty shine forth in different ways. And then that's how you start having a basis of pluralism that invites people in. But then the basis of that pluralism is not primarily information, but us collectively figuring out how to formulate from within our maps where we've come upon that Gödel point to see it as a dance because you're participating in it, not thinking about the lack. Like what we said about games being arbitrary when you think about them, apply very much to lack. When you think about lack, you say, oh, that's nihilistic and terrible. But when you experience and you're always already in the game or the dance or whatever, then you see the beauty come forth. You see the intrinsic motivation. You see the possibility of moving from desire to drive, et cetera, so forth. And yeah, I know dinner's coming, Mr. Kashir. I'm going to miss it. It's like, I'm going to eat all the marinara sauce before you come downstairs. I saw it, Jacob. I saw it. But let me get to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
I will be quick because I want you to eat that marinara sauce. A little jealous. Love marinara sauce. Okay, so a lot. That was really good. Okay. Let's where to start. Okay, so history. Let's take history as an ideology, like something that Schelling talks about is how history can only be history if there is an end to history. And if you understand history as the context in which things happen, then from the point of view of the context of things happening, us understanding the content of things happening under a certain context, call it history, ends. So it's not that things end, but the context in which we understand the happening ends. And that's like a point that I think Schelling brings out. I think basically the name of the game is to think about context and not about content. And I think I mean you articulated that point really well. I just like Fukuyama, I didn't read his book, but I've listened to a decent amount of people, or I don't know if I said his name right, but whatever. Basically, history, like things aren't going to end, but how we understand what's happening is going to end, and it's just going to be a new context that needs to like emerge that was already present in the previous context. But the thing that's what's present in the previous context, like you said, is like the lack is the fact that it does have an end. But the constant is things are happening. That's the constant. So like the concept of home is a fixed content. Like it doesn't matter what era the human being is in, but the notion of home is a always already existing piece of content that we have to deal with. So I guess the like part of the I guess it sounds like it's just a natural thing that will be occurring. I am just curious that, well, two things I'm curious. One, if it's a natural occurring thing that's going to be happening no matter what, is that like one, a fair thing to say? And two, what's the point of bringing attention to it if like there's a fear that I'm getting is that if we do bring attention to it, maybe we prevent it from even happening. Like ironically, it's like by us doing this, we think we're doing something good per se, but in actuality, what happens is the ironic move. That's one thing. The second thing is to lean into the gap, and like I've said this a lot of times, but it's just like to lean into this gap in every ideology, which I agree with. I agree with that claim. It's if you focus on the gap, then within the ideology, you're focusing on the lack. And if you're focusing on the lack, a lot of times you're thinking about, in a certain sense, what's not good. And you're not really coming at it from this more of the beauty perspective. But then, like as Jockin's point out, when we come at it from the beauty perspective, we really have no idea what like the approach is in a certain sense. Like the approach is way more mysterious, way less transparent until it happens in that moment, and then you know. But like going into it, you really won't know. So the focus on the partial object makes sense, but it's about how do you frame the partial object where it is looking at lack, but from this more eminent position. And if we do that, like for me, that's theme. Like if we do that, is there a chance that, because like at a certain point in the story, you kind of stop thinking about the theme because it's just unfolding. Like you've thought about it so much that it's just like, okay, this happens and this and this and this and this, and you don't need to like really explicitly think about it. It seems like we're in a point where we need to explicitly think about it. I guess I'm just circling back to my first question, I suppose. I'm just scared that by us making it explicit, that it won't allow us to release it. Like we're going to hold on to it too tight. And we won't, in that sense, let the beauty shine through, or however you want to put it. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Beautiful. Well, I've certainly enjoyed today, and I appreciate you all being here. So a few things come to mind. If I make explicit the good and say we have to do the good, it feels oppressive and like somebody has duty, right? If I make the good explicit, then it seems to die. The good is collapsed into the legality or kind of force, right? If I make explicit the true, then it feels arbitrary. Like if I talk about the true, it feels like it doesn't have any meaning. So what? A rock is a rock. Cool, fact, right? But how do you make beauty explicit? How do you make beauty explicit, right? You say, well, you talk about the Mona Lisa, the Grand Canyon. Ah, that's making the aesthetic explicit. The beautiful has to be a strike. How do you make something that must be encountered explicit? There's no way. You have to go to it. The key to beauty is when it is encounterology and I guess lackology are fundamentally tied together, because lack must be encountered. Otherwise, you're just talking about, actually, you're treating lack. If you think about it, when you think about lack is not lacking, it's present as an idea, right? That's the funny thing. Lack actually must be encountered. Whenever you talk about lack, you're lacking lack in the talking about it, right? Because it has to be fundamentally encountered. Being, though, when I present you with words, they're being, you're encountering being. Maybe they're not a being of cat in the same way word cat, but when I talk to you, you are having the same ontological experience as the subject of what I am discussing, right? And when I talk about nothing, I'm not talking about nothing. So that's just a straight up contradiction, right? But when I talk about lack, I'm talking about something meaningful that is pointing to something you must go encounter. So I actually can't make it explicit. I can make being explicit, I can make the good explicit, I can make the true explicit, but I can't actually make lack explicit, because fundamentally lack is lacking from the discussion about it. It is always an encounter. So it goes with beauty. Whenever I talk about beauty, I am talking about a thing that you cannot get unless you experience it, unless you encounter it and it surprises you. And that right there, here's the advantage. The very fact that it is so freaking weird to talk about beauty is precisely the defense mechanism from keeping the very talking about it, from keeping it from going away. The very fact that talking about lack as a basis for society is kind of your brain does like, oh, what does that mean exactly? That's precisely why making explicit doesn't kill it in the same way that making other things explicit kill it, right? And that, the other way to look at this is we're talking about some sort of problem, because there's this issue. So there's a few things here, because you also made this key points like, well, if it's unfolding anyway, why do we have to draw attention to it, right? Because lack is not self-evidently lack. The experience of lack could be interpreted as nothing. That's why we have to say lack is not nothing. You have to choose to interpret lack as not nothing, when naturally you would experience lack as nothing. And that's the final absolute choice. That's the ultra absolute choice upon which everything rides, is that the average person upon planet Earth interprets lack as not nothing versus lack as nothing. And the natural tendency of the experience of lack is to think of it as nothing, because you experience it as if it is, because it's this thing that's gone and fleeting and you're convinced you're crazy. What was that I even experienced? Maybe it was all in your brain. People have mystical experiences and then easily later on question it, or they move away. Some of the most, like they fall in love with someone and then 20 years later, like maybe I was outside of my mind. There's a natural tendency to move toward lack as nothing. And that's what you have to consciously fight against. And it is precisely the weirdness of lack that makes it possible to draw attention to the need to choose absolutely that lack is not nothing, that keeps the drawing attention to that from killing the subject. That very weirdness, the need to kind of keep dancing it, is precisely the strength and the curse of lack. The weirdness of talking about beauty is precisely the strength and the curse of it. It is the defense mechanism of beauty against the logos that seeks to eat it. And so by having that sort of escape feel, fleeing feel, here and gone, that's why it has a natural protection mechanism from the tendency of the ironic. And the very tendency of the ironic, and then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin, is what has this is what has happened. History is a story of showing that the good is not defended from the ironic, the true is not defended from the ironic, but now we're at the point of saying that beauty is. But we still have to make the absolute choice that such is the case, and that requires the final absolute choice that lack is not nothing. Mr. Jockin, please.
No, I mean, Daniel, that's a good build up. But that's the whole, yeah, you basically took most of what I was going to say. Yeah, just to kind of build on that point, I agree with, like, here's the thing. If we don't have a measure, even if, but being aware of the gap makes us able to start pursuing answers. Because half the art of life is finding the questions. Remember, because the whole part of Plato's dialogues, the vast majority, the ones that are interesting for Plato, is his questioning, is the questions he presents. And it takes basically his students later, Aristotle and the Stoics, for example, to answer those questions, right? And then, as Daniel pointed out, those led to certain consequences, and now we found out they were in error, because the most classic one from Plato, because that's the thing. Actually, I was just talking to John Vervaeke about this last week, because he presents right to my face about it. He says, he pointed up the question. It's like, does Plato is the transcendental nature of the good, the true, and the beautiful? And, we both agreed. We said, if you read his dialogues, he does not give you an answer. And in fact, the dialogues seem to show, at the very minimum, they're in contention. Is good the son of the beautiful, as said in Greater Hippias, or is the good the light that gives intelligibility to everything, as said in Republic? Which one is it? It's a much more nuanced. It's not so clean cut. And as Vervaeke says, the Neoplatonist took the account and saw the tensions inside the dialogues and said, the one is the good. Pack it up. Like, just pack it up. The one is the good, which is the beautiful, and we move on with our lives. But there was consequences that came from that. So, and we're living the consequences of that centuries later, millennium later. So I think the basic point is, I agree with you, just kind of spiraling around it is not good enough. I totally agree with you. If your concern is that's totally fair. But sometimes it does require reconsideration of the question. Because when you craft the question correctly, at least you can have a reference. That's a question is a kind of measure. Like, it's not quantitative per se. It's not like a measurement with a numeric attachment to it, but it is a question. It's qualitative. Because if you ask the question, if you acknowledge the beautiful as what we're talking about here, and by the way, like, the kind of closest approximation we can reference is the idea of surprise, right? Which is from active inference, computer cognitive science. Like, that's a measurement, right? They can draw, but even without that, the point of when we have a measure as is this beautiful, and we're saying it's not aesthetic preferences, and it's not the good, it's something else. That gives you at least a measure, a reference point to actions, activities. So, for example, just to draw this point, I got caught on my own thought, I realized it. So remember, I'm asking this question, hey guys, we're seeing all this stuff with Web3 and crypto. Remember all that energy about that? And that really did seem like innovative technology and really innovative, like, imaginative thinking. But why did it fail? It failed, and that's what we have an answer to that. At least we say, well, because it's not oriented to the beautiful. It was oriented towards the good. So it gives us an account of reference to at least say, to give an investigation and look at things and say, well, why is that the beauty? Is that the beautiful? Was that coordinated around the beautiful? In fact, even asking that question, questions are a kind of measure. I kind of end in that point. The very act of the question is actually very revolutionary. It's the same reason why a Marxist account allows you to kind of come into almost any engagement and ask serious actions of suspicion. So generally, psychoanalytics, Marxism, maybe, and then maybe, I don't know, Nietzschean power dynamics, right? Those are the master suspicion. What do those do? Those are basically antiseptics to kind of dumbing, kind of blasé, indifferent attitudes of social social dynamics or cultural dynamics or phenomenon. That's what those were those thought accounts do. What we're discussing with the beautiful is a kind of, instead of an antiseptic anti-acid, which is supposed to destroy, basically an ironic stance. Almost all those positions have an ironic stance. They basically say the presentation, the person in front of me is not the reality. It's an appearance of power, of sex, or whatever. Take your pick, right? Or an affiliation. What we're doing is we're pointing out that the beautiful actually gives a positive account. It actually says, no, this is lacking because it is not beautiful. It is not this engagement, this social order, this technology is actually lacking because it does not have beauty at the core of its intention and thought. So anyways, I just want to chew on that point because it gives us, so I agree with you, the tension here of just kind of, is there a danger to talk about this? Actually, yes, partly because it's so easily misunderstood and so easily collapsed into propaganda, into the aesthetic, to use that language, right? It's very easy. And in fact, there's a reason why the language actually in Phaedrus is about initiation to the beautiful. You have to be initiated. It's almost like you can tell, like in the background of that dialogue, there's a discussion going on. There's stuff going on that's not stated. And which is a common thing about all laws and everything written down. Everything written down is just a shorthand. There's always something unspoken that gave a context in the background. That if you just read the text, this is exactly why in like theological traditions, they argue for the necessity of tradition. Because the text itself does not give you self-enclosed all the rationality of the reasoning and the context of what's being done. Anyways, this is just circling around these points in many different directions. I hope this is useful, Uber.
That was magnificent. So the more a thing moves to the apathetic. So with the true and the good, the problem is it's too easily understood. The problem with the beauty is that it's too easily misunderstood. Like there's always that movement, like in theology, as you head toward the deeper, like from the religion to the mystical, it moves from the problem of, oh yeah, I know how to be saved. I go to church. It's too easily understood. But then as you go to the mystical and the deeper, it's too easily misunderstood because then you start coming up with theologies outside of the religion and it goes wherever, right? So there's this way in which intellectual, theological, human maturity, if you will, is a movement from a space where the problem is too easily understanding to a problem where it's too easily misunderstood. But if you think about it, too easily misunderstood is actually way harder because how do you understand when you're misunderstanding? And how do you check yourself, right? That seems like impossible. Whereas I could theoretically more easily say, well, I know that the word cat is never the phenomenon of cat, so whatever I understand is probably limited. That seems easier to get. The place where you kind of realize understanding is overfitted, right? But when you move to the place where you're misunderstanding, how do you know you're misunderstanding? Because if you did, you would have already changed, right? No one knows they're misunderstanding or they're not. That's the problem of true ignorance. Like we make a major mistake. There's knowing you know something. It's like the black swan, right? There's knowing you don't know something, and then there's not knowing you don't know something, right? The more you move toward lack and beauty, the more you are at risk of that true ignorance, right? And so the question is the following. How in the world do you avoid that problem? Because if you are in it, you wouldn't know you're in it. A few things. I think also I just want to note with the Plato and the dialogue, there's a way in which Plato is making explicit that he never makes beauty explicit. Like that's the explicit bit. That's like lack. Like the thing is you make explicit about lack, that lack is a present absence. There's this weird thing you're making explicit that is the lack of the explicitness. Which then again, if you go through all these mystical traditions and religions, they make explicit that this is beyond words. They tell you God's beyond words. And you're like, but here's the problem. You come to understand that God is beyond words. So you think you understand what that means because outside of an encounter, it's not really what they're talking about. The word ineffable is not the experience of ineffable, but it feels like it. And so then you get cut off from the thing, right? When I tell you words failed me, we go, oh, I understand that. Oh, well, I guess the word succeeded then. They said words failed me and you understood what they were referring to. Well, that's not it then. Like the moment you understand anything that is drawing the limits of language, you have not actually encountered the limits of language, right? So if we're talking about some sort of centrality of beauty, some sort of fundamental structure of lack, it must be a surprise. It must be an encounter. It must be a matter of infrastructure that formulates versus infrastructure that informs. Because what you are doing is spreading the conditions of increasing the probability for the average person on the planet to encounter the ineffable versus understand the ineffable, which is precisely the logical contradiction that leads to all sorts of pathologies. The moment you think you know the ineffable, then you have actually, if you think about it, set yourself up for a self-effacing contradiction because you think you know that which you do not know. And so, of course, you get pathologies because that doesn't make any sense. The only way for the ineffable to make sense is to encounter it as that beyond sense. And so lack must be something you're formulated into versus something you're informed about, because that's the only way it can be surprising. So what does that mean? We talked earlier, Mr. Luber, about this notion of some kind of sacrifice has to be in the picture, right? How do you make context central? How do you make context central? Because the moment I talk about context, is it not the text? Is it not the subject, right? There doesn't seem to be. There's only one way that you can find the Gödel point and actually encounter it as the Gödel point, as the lack, as the, like, if your subject is context, that means you're trying to encounter the Gödel point that recalls a reflexivity back on the context, because you see the lack and you see the context. The context is central because of lack. The only way to make context the subject is by encountering the lack in the context. That makes you ask questions of what the context must be like to make you encounter that context, right? Guess what? You have to encounter that, which means you sacrifice yourself because you know you are doing something that will ultimately lead to a lack, not completion, and that's a sacrifice. And that ultimately is meaning you're pouring all of your time and energy into something not to gain it, but to see it lacking. That's the sacrifice. And it is in that reflexivity that shoots you back to see the context that is the glimmer, right? The glimmer of eternity to the transcends the mystical vision. Chiton had a wonderful comment on this idea of how do you ever come to see lack as lacking? For most people in the history of the world, they'll talk about a mystical experience. Beatrice walking down the road, there's a glimmer that makes you aware that the possible appearance or manifestation of every phenomenon on planet Earth is different than you think. Because if you experience once in your life, if once in your life you experience beauty, then that means it's always possible anywhere. Even if it happens once, then it's always there in the conditions of possibility. And thus maturity, if you will, this kind of philosophical maturity, is the moment in one's life when you encounter the lack and then boom, it's gone, and you wake up and you say, what was that? And so many of the great thinkers are constantly referring to some memory of something that they had. Caddy is climbing in the tree for Faulkner, Master Eckhart, something, and you're like, everything has a different quality because of a quality that happened once. The one, and if we take that kind of play off the Neoplatonic, the one is the central, but it's the one partial object that changes the possible quality of every different thing. So the one time you had the mystical, the one time you had the glimmer of eternity, that suggests that there is some condition of possibility that is present in all things, but it's a glimmer, not a certain sort of resting of a final indifferentiated state. It's a glimmer. The one glimmer changes the every one thing into a possible partiality if you can meet the conditions of hitting it. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. But the only way to meet the conditions of so encountering it is sacrificial. I know that the thing I go to, if I do it well, will ultimately be lacking. But that is the point. But it's also scary because you don't know how long that will take. What if it takes 10 years? What if it takes 20? What if it takes 2? The uncertainty about the amount of time that it will take to encounter the lack is precisely another reason why it avoids being into the ironic, right? Because there's an uncertainty there that requires a perpetual sacrifice that you cannot calculate, and you may have to sacrifice yourself all the days of your life. Maybe it never happens. What if it never happens? That's the necessary risk for the possibility of the encounterology, of the lackology, of you will, by which a final absolute choice can occur. And that's why it's meaningful. And that's why if you scale that and you make it explicit, you do not kill it. I should also note, then I'll give it to Luke and Mr. Jonkin. Scale, the problem of scale is that the problem of scale is what unveils where a collapse of the beautiful and the good has occurred and people not realized it. Scale always unveils that, oh, actually in capitalism, the beautiful and the good were collapsed and you didn't know it. Oh, actually in communism, they were collapsed. We are now at the age where the problem of scale via the globalization and all the global networks has forced us to see, oh, beauty and good are distinct, and we have to scale beauty. And that's an encounterology that requires some sort of sacrifice and conditioning that we've never had the infrastructure for, but we have it now, so we better think about that. Mr. Luber, please.
Yeah, Jock, and that was helpful. Daniel, that was great. So okay, like I'm kind of just riffing off of my comments that I put in the group chat. Basically, when experiencing lack, I keep want to just bring up my nervousness about all this. Like, I think this is all great, and I'm like for this stuff, generally speaking. Like, I'm not like actually disagreeing. Just wanted to throw that out there. It's so hard to, when me and you are undertaking an experience and we both encounter lack, it would make sense that it would be different experience for you than it would be for me. And in that sense, it's hard to see how lack is present in context and not in the present content in which we're experiencing it, because it, from an emotional standpoint, like crudely, it's like something that you have to deal with that's very strenuous, and it seems like it takes like an extra like willpower to kind of see past your unique lack in that experience and kind of see how it's just like the girdle point, see how it relates to the context. But like once you do get to the point where you see the lack in context, basically when you get to that point, you can then, like, in a certain sense, like generate how you deal with content. You could generate like you're more control with your responses at that point, like generally. So if that's the case, it's like you have your ontic lack, but the name of the game is to like have this ontological lack and make it accessible to everybody. And that would have to do with naming the ontological lack and being aware of it. So like, for example, like right now we're in history is how we see it. But we don't understand how history in terms of ontology is lacking. To us, we see it as a fixed thing, that it was a concept that emerged that was always already present, but it was just a more explicit concept to something that was already there. So it seems like it's like, from an ontological standpoint, not lacking. Like there's always history. So when you get to the point where history ends, it's not that things are happening end, but things happening and we calling it being part of history ends. We come up with a different term, let's call it objective fiction. And now things are happening under objective fiction. It seems like throughout life, throughout the human history, there's always been objective fiction, but for 1,000 years or so, we were calling it history. And then the concept of history came to an end, and now we have objective fiction. So my point in outlining this is that when we keep finding these cycles and we keep coming up with new things to keep the happening happen, is there a lack to the cycle, to the happening itself? So is there, like, we have history, then objective fiction, and then we have Y and X and Z and all these different terms that capture the same thing, but even though that it's not the same thing, it's because different things are happening under that context, and that's why that context is named differently. So it's like we have objective fictions because we have different particular things happening that give rise to this notion of objective fiction. But is there a lack, essentially, of the giving rise is there a lack of naming the context? Or in other words, is there a lack to seeing the theme? like to actually just seeing the theme. Like, yes, there's a lack of seeing the whole theme. Like you're just finite, the theme is infinite. But is there a lack to the possibility of glimpsing the theme? Like, is that even, if that's the thing, then it's possible for like forget human beings, but just consciousness or just any type of extension of what a human being is could cease to be if that's the case. But it doesn't seem like that is possible just because we're in this universe where it seems like we need an observer within the universe to know that we're in the universe. Seems like if that happens, then there's no more universe at that point. So I hope I made sense in terms of like my question here. But yeah, I'll pass it
It's
on.
outstanding. I'll give it to Mr. Juggen. Lack is lacking you. You make possible the relationship of lack, of which then is the conditioning of it. You know, there's that idea that God created to have a relationship, right? And you kind of, and then the issue is if God is ever approaching in the lack in the terms of finitude, but then there's the question of the following. Okay, because you were saying there's this lack in the finitude, but then there's a lack in the theme, and they're actually different. A way I've talked about that, not that I'm saying it's never released, but it's like the theology. There's capital G God, but then there's all caps God, which is like, so capital G God is the one that chose to create. He chose to create us and we relate to him, right? And that's and that has an infinity in the beautiful. But then there's the all caps God, which is why did he choose to create in the first place and in a way be conditioned by our relationship with him in being related with him? That doesn't reduce him, but there's a certain, like once God chooses to create, there's a sense in which God can't choose to uncreate, right? Because let's say, and that in a way conditions what God is, right? Which would suggest there's a kind of sacrifice in God in choosing to so do that. Because if you say, well, no, God could choose to create and then uncreate, but wouldn't that mean that God like made a mistake or something? Or it's like wouldn't that kind of mean there's some sort of arbitrary? Maybe he could and then erase his own mind that he did that. You could get really you could get really nuts with all this if you wanted, right? But the point is the following. There's a sense in which when all caps God chooses to create, thus becomes, and I'm not trying to be heretical or anything, although I might be, so we'll see. But, you know, if there's this way, like we're all caps God, and I'm not saying all caps God is different in essence from capital G God, because that would be heresy. What I'm saying is that this all caps God chooses to create. Now, there are theological debates between where God in his essence must create, or God chooses to create and then his essence is so defined. Now, that would be a line of argument you could take. That's a very extensive conversation. We can have it, but I think it's very important. But there's a notion where you could say, at least metaphorically to answer your question, that all caps God chooses to create, thus becomes capital G God, which is then conditioned in a relationship with man that then has this infinite finite lack quality of ever beauty. But then the question is, why did God choose to do that? Well, you'd have to be God, because only God could know every possible condition of every possible world, and for some reason decided that creating was what he wanted to do. Why? Well, maybe it was arbitrary. Maybe because it's love. Maybe because God is God. Maybe God is beautiful. There's a certain lack in the theme there that is not a testament to arbitrariness, but to God being God. It's axiomatic at that point. Like God is the being of whom can choose something lacking in its theme, and no other being can do that. Right? That is like what God is. And the absolute choice is alignment with that ontological condition with infinitude that doesn't become like God, but aligned with God in the being as such, right? So, you know, that's kind of theology talks all the time about trying to align with God's being, right? Well, if in God there is some sort of ultimate, well, God created because God is God and he did, and there's a kind of lack in that theme, then us in making an absolute choice is in a sense like that, which is fitting for man, because you are like God and yet at the same time not God. So there's still a humility in it, right? There's still you're not claiming to be God, but you're actually following God's example. And what's more faithful than that? Like, what is a servant of God supposed to do but try to follow God's example, knowing darn well they'll never be the master, knowing darn well they'll never match up to God, and yet you still believe it's good to try to follow that example, right? So another way to put this is I would note that as we make lack explicit, please note that me saying make lack explicit in this conversation is not actually encountering lack. As you encounter lack, because you heard this conversation, maybe. You go out and try to encounter it. And then when you encounter it, you fly back on the context and you see all of reality different. Well, now reality different is a subject. So there's a meta move, and then that is the subject. This is the meta-modern impulse. You have an ever reference of a new subject that the context is drawn into that creates a finite infinity. But now you have to make the absolute choice on, well, I guess it's arbitrary then. That's one choice. Lack is nothing. Or you say, no, no, no. The ever recursivity and meta-modernity reference on the context becoming the subject is precisely the structure of finitude that makes it possible to ever encounter the beautiful. So that is good. And I'm going to continue humbly to choose to participate in that because I think it is best. And hey, maybe that's what God intended. So God intended me not to make the absolute choice of seeing that meta reference as arbitrary and nothingness. Actually, the humbleness is to trust that if God made the world that way, it is good, and I will believe in him. And so you're aligning a notion of a theological faithfulness and encountering that recursivity as what God intended. And God is the endpoint of it because God has gotten, he has the mind of God to do an ontologically lacking thing where man does not. Humans do not. And so you have a distinction in that. And then you have, but then you still have to make the decision to trust that it is good. You have to trust that it is good as such. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin here. Mr. Jockin.
This is the after-hour theology talk now. We're in that game. Obviously, for anyone who listens to discuss this, who does not get on this train of the theology account, they're off this train. They've been off for a while. But that's also one of the important things about why lack is so important, because it is this in virtue of the two modes that you can present a natural theology to someone who's not a believer. And if they're reasonable persuading this, there'll be necessary consequences that come from that. Now, the particular God, as we're demonstrating, can get very messy very quickly, and these answers cannot be answered by them directly. Plus, that's just, I do want to observe that point. Okay, but with that said, I'll work backwards. First, what Daniel says. Okay, so here's a very important part. I'll use my Islamic background for this. So when we come to this act of the creative act, right, which is said to be generated via our imitative power, we're like God in that sense. Islam has a very clear answer to this point because there are three names, the beautiful names to God: the creator, the originator, the fastener. I'll just give the English translations of them. Now, what's very important in the Islamic theology about this is that the only one of those three that human beings actually can participate with is the fastener. What that means is we only can work with what's already in existence. And the thing is, even in thought, that's the point, is that even in our thought, it already pre-existed in God. And that's actually, that is the theological argument of lack, that every time you encounter lack and you have that ultimate choice, right, of basically seeing this as nothing or as lack, the point is lack already has built in it a presumption of something could be here, right? So that is an act of the fastener, which is to work with the materials that already have existence to generate through that, right? To kind of produce with that. So we don't make the tree, but we can convert a tree from that to a house, for example. I guess to draw out one of those points. The other part of that, so that's just to kind of answer that part about like what safeguard us from being overly arrogant in our relationship with God, is the Islamic point of view is when we say, I made this, you fastened it. Like that'd be the language we would use. Being the creator or the originator, that's only God's providence, that he has those powers. They basically, it's the presupposition of something does not come from nothing. That is the domain we exist on. The domain God exists on, it is ex nihilo. So therefore, and there you go. And that leads to the very common, and actually in Islamic tradition too, there's questions about God's divine freedom. There are accounts that say it's absolutely free, and God could change his mind at any time. And actually build on this from the ethic moral point of view. Everything God does is by definition good. So if he turned to you and said, go kill your first begotten son as a sacrifice to me, that's actually morally good because God is the definition of good. He is the exemplar causer of goodness. So thus everything he does and commands and wishes and desires is good via that. So that's a theological account. So, and thus he's actually not bound by even his prior acts. There's theological disagreements about that, or challenges about that. Just want to point that out. All right. With that said, one other chewing note I'm going to chew on is that it's from St. Teresa about this. When you have God, you have everything. Basically, God lacks nothing. I think that's an interesting. I've chewed on that for a very long time, because it just draws out, if lack is nothing, why would that term be, how is that comprehensible to us that God lacks nothing? It's fascinating. I think I chew on that a lot, because of the significance of that for various reasons. I don't want to take, I already said a lot, so I want to leave it alone. Just everyone chew on that. But another thing too, like, well, Luber, you're bringing out this thing about history, and then it became, social fiction, and this conditional fictions, as you say, right? There's always been a reading of the question of the reading of literature, like the scripture. Like, there are 4 modes of reading it: the historical, literal, allegorical, tropaic, and anagonical, right? So there's different modes of reading of things. So that's an example of just choice. The same content can be read in different ways. And I think that's kind of the tension about this. Well, not even tension, that's just on your questions. I think that's part of the point, is that actually what happened when a lot of times people, especially contemporary, we think history is supposed to be the literal truth. It's just facts. We forgot that history actually is interpretation too, right? But then people get panicked, because then it means, wait a minute, is there any truth? Is there anything around us? Or are we just talking just a bunch of basically warfare of opinions, right? Warfare of different judgments of opinions of who has power, and then they get the call what's history. I'm just pointing out, like, that's the kind of anxieties we're drawing out. Is drawing that out. What happened was that, yeah, history's lacking because it tells emphasizes certain ideas and doesn't reveal others. And the modes of reading about history can be about the facts on the ground, and can be the meaning and significance of those acts. This has been already built into it. But yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for now.
No, that's outstanding. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. Alas, I should run and eat that marinara sauce. So there's a way to look at this where the question is the relation of freedom and essence in God. Is God's freedom limited by his essence, or does God choose his essence? Like, his freedom is over his essence. Different theologies have different answers, right? But the very fact they all have different answers and we cannot answer that means that it's a lack. Like, the answer itself is a lack. Like, the theme itself has a lack in it. Like, your theme, like, this is the point. The very command of theme has authority because you don't know that answer, that you are lacking that answer. So thus, there being some kind of lack in theme is precisely, if you will, what makes possible it commanding you toward beauty, which is the lack in the theme. Like, so even if every theology has a different response to the relation between freedom and essence, the very fact that you can't know that in of itself is the defining quality of the theme that gives it the authority to compel you toward itself as beauty. That the theme, so that's a key move, because, and there's another way. I love that line, that God lacks nothing, because that kind of suggests that in God is lack. There is a kind of lack of nothing in his very conditionality, right? Another way, so God lacks nothing. So God lacks nothing. That's his glory. But the moment we say, like, the phrase God lacks nothing requires us to say, because we are saying God lacks nothing. Like that, does God experience lack? It's a weird thing where the characteristic of lack is the invitation to relate to him, right? So God lacking nothing is not a limitation on God. It's an opening for us to discuss him. The lack is the horizon of the possibility of discussing God, right? Like if you didn't lack God, you'd be God, right? So so there's another funny way in which you could say God lacks versions of us that fully understand God in God's fullness at all points of being, right? Because that would mean God lacks God in a way, right? Because God is God, so he lacks God. So there's a weird thing in which we in relation to God, in that very conditioning, the lack is the possibility of the relation of the conditioning to so relate to God, so you can receive a theme that says you must change your life and go toward beauty, right? The relation creates the lack that makes the possibility of the theme that is a testament to lack toward the beauty. Because when you say, I wonder how God's freedom relates to God's essence, you have a sense that there's a beauty in that tension that lacking the answer compels you to approach, and then your life is so conditioned by that, right? And so that is then, you just have to choose that when you experience the infinite finitude version of lack, the absolute choice is to say lack is not nothing, that it's lack not nothing, and that is commanding me toward the theme of lack that is in God. And so lack is not nothing. And so you're compelled toward that as God being conditioned by lack, not in of itself, but in our relation to us. And that's why we can move toward him. And so that then becomes the basis of the possibility of movement in his direction. Now you start thinking final calls, beatific vision, and all those other stuff they've been talking about for hundreds of years, but took us, 1,000 years to realize what they were talking about. That's how it goes, because history is the story of encountering that which is always already, that then in seeing can put a command on your life that you must change it and move toward the beautiful. But here's the final point, I suppose, final of 6 final points, that's usually how it goes, is that the structure of theology is the structure of, I guess, lackology, and that if indeed, I guess the theological point would be, if indeed, if you look at reality and you look at economics and you look at politics and you look at objective fictions, and it all seems to require some lackology, and theology is fundamentally lackology, that would suggest that, that could be an apologetic basis for theology. But regardless, the very overlap suggests the necessity of the human making an absolute choice. You say, no, it's just theology is simply a projection of lackology in a Feuerbach sense, like God is our Father and that's based on it. Regardless, let's say you think theology is nonsense. The very fact theology has a lackology structure to it is evidence that reality is in fact lackology, because we subconsciously created theologies that have a lackology to them when we didn't mean to, which means we created a context while we were intending a different subject that actually suggests a subconscious that was in operation that now is becoming something we are encountering at this point in history. So the very fact that theology took on a lackology structure, even if we did not necessarily mean to, means it could be a glimmer into the subconscious background by which we operate that we had to go through history to look at explicitly, and until now could only talk about it indirectly in theology, which might be evidence that theology has always been reality at the same time, or it could be evidence regardless, either way that answer. You must make a choice because you are lacking that. And so regardless, you must make an absolute choice. And I think that defines our moment. I must eat that marinara sauce. This has been a complete delight. Thank you all. I appreciate it. It's been a joy. You're all awesome. Thank you.